Late that night, I wanted to surprise my wife for her upcoming birthday, so I decided to repaint the home office. I started by moving this antique grandfather clock out of the corner, but as I pulled it away, I noticed a hidden compartment built deep into the wall panel, right behind the pendulum. Inside, there were 4 different passports. Every single one of them had my wife's face on it, but each had a completely different name. Right next to them was a black encrypted hard drive. By 1:13 a.m., I finally cracked the last folder. The first thing I heard was a recording of her laughing. She said, "He's completely losing his mind now. One more signature and everything is ours." My whole body went numb. It hit me right then. I'd never actually known my wife. I really appreciate you being here to listen to this today. Before we go any further, do me a quick favor and leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Tell me your city, your country, and what time it is for you right now. I read every single comment, and it truly means the world to me. Now, just so you know, this story does include some fictionalized elements meant for reflection and warning. Any resemblance to real events is pure coincidence, but the lesson it teaches is something you will definitely want to remember. I first realized something was wrong when I was moving that antique grandfather clock, the one that used to belong to my late wife. The edge of the wall panel felt loose. The secrets that came to light in that moment had been hiding in my walls for a very long time, long before my second marriage even started. It was a Tuesday morning in November, and a Chicago blizzard was slamming against the windows. I woke up at 6:30 a.m., brewed some coffee, and went upstairs to the second-floor office. I stood there looking at the walnut grandfather clock that had been sitting in that exact spot for almost 20 years. It belonged to Clara. My first wife absolutely loved it. She used to say the steady ticking reminded her of our younger days by Lake Michigan, back when everything felt perfectly still right before a massive snowstorm hit. My name is Richard Vance. I'm 65 years old, and I own a boutique architectural design and historical preservation firm here in Chicago. That morning, I thought I was just doing something nice. My second wife, Elena, was down in Miami, attending a high-end art appraisal forum for 3 days. Her 45th birthday was just 5 days away, and she had mentioned in passing that the office felt too dark and needed a brighter, fresher color. Since she was gone, I figured I would move the clock out of the way and get the painting done before she got back. With Elena away, our house up on the North Shore felt completely different. It was strangely quiet. We had been married for 4 years. We met back in 2014 at a charity art auction and ended up getting married just 6 months later. She was 41 at the time, sharp, brilliant, and working as the director of a top-tier gallery. She had this incredible sense of humor that could make me truly laugh, something I hadn't done since Clara passed away from an illness in 2015. My son, David, didn't come to our wedding. That became a massive wedge between us, a heavy silence between father and son that I had no idea how to break. But at 7:23 a.m. that morning, with the smell of coffee drifting up from the kitchen, I wasn't thinking about David, and I wasn't thinking about who wasn't there. My mind was entirely on Clara's clock. I should have moved it to a safer spot for maintenance a long time ago. I set my coffee down on the mahogany desk and gripped the frame of the clock. It was heavier than I remembered. Solid wood casing, solid brass pendulum, a full 7 feet tall. I carefully slid it away from the wall, lining it up against the bookshelf. That was when the panel moved. It wasn't just loose. It had been deliberately cut out. The edge of the wainscoting, which had been completely hidden by the body of the clock, caved inward when my elbow accidentally brushed against it. I hooked my fingers under the edge and pulled the wooden board straight out. Behind it was a hidden compartment. It wasn't huge, maybe 8 inches wide and 10 inches high, carved out between the load-bearing studs years ago with incredible precision. The wood inside was a much darker color than the surrounding walls. Inside the compartment, something was wrapped in a soft black velvet cloth. I reached in and pulled it out. It was a matte black mobile solid-state drive. It felt colder than the rest of the wall, and it was heavier in my hand than it looked, just small enough to fit into a shirt pocket. As the velvet cloth unraveled, the hard drive sat quietly in my palm. showing a metal sensor on the side meant for a fingerprint unlock. You could buy this kind of high-end tech at any electronics store, but this one was hidden deep in my wall, right behind my late wife's favorite clock, in a secret space I never knew existed. How long had it been sitting there? How many times had I walked past this exact wall, looked at this clock, and sat at this desk drawing up blueprints, completely oblivious to the fact that a secret was hiding less than 2 feet from my head? Did Clara build this compartment? It had to be her. Before I turned this room into an office, it was her art studio. That was back before she got sick, before the brain aneurysm took everything away from us. She must have carved out this space, or hired someone to do it, to hide something here. But why? I placed the hard drive on the desk and reached into the dark compartment a second time. My fingers brushed against something else. Smooth, rectangular objects. I pulled them out. 4 passports. I opened the first one. It was a French passport. The woman in the photo had vibrant red hair, green eyes, and an elegant smile. The name read Sophie Lavigne, born in Lyon, 1979. It was Elena's face. I flipped open the second one, an Australian passport. Emma Wilson, born in Sydney, 1977. The exact same face, but with short blonde hair in the photo. The third one was a Canadian passport. Carmen Lopez, born in Toronto, 1975. Still the exact same face. The fourth one was an American passport. Elena Hayes, born in Chicago, 1974. The same face, my wife's face. 4 different names, 4 different birth years, 4 different countries. I sank heavily into my office chair, reaching into the compartment one last time. There was one more thing inside, a folded sheet of standard white printer paper. I unfolded it. It was a list, neatly typed out with 10 names. Next to each name, there was a city, a year, and a brief psychological assessment. Boston, 2004. Miami, 2006. Seattle, 2009. The notes read things like, recently widowed, socially isolated, high net worth trust fund, and incredibly trusting. No immediate family. Perfect target. The 8th name on that list was mine. Richard Vance, Chicago, 2014. Absolute trust. Completely defenseless if approached correctly. Weakness. Son. Handled. Target. 8. That number hit my chest like a block of lead. 8. I wasn't the first one, not even close. There were 7 men before me. 7 cities. 7 different years. And right below my name, there were 2 more names I didn't recognize, marked with future dates and massive dollar amounts. Weakness, son, handled. What did that even mean? Handled. I looked back at the passports, lining them up side by side across the desk. Sophie, Emma, Carmen, Elena. 4 different identities, 4 entire lives, all worn by the exact same woman, the woman I had married 4 years ago, the woman I had trusted with my family, my finances, and the memory of my late wife. The woman who had called me from Miami just 2 nights ago, sounding so sweet over the phone, saying, "I miss you, babe. I can't wait to come home." Outside, the Chicago blizzard kept beating against the glass, cold and relentless. The black hard drive sat silently next to the passports, its contents still unread. A part of me already knew that I didn't want to see what was on it, but I knew I had to face it eventually. I sat down right there on the wooden floor of the office, leaning my back against the wall, gripping the 4 passports with my wife's face on them. The empty compartment above me looked like an open, mocking mouth, revealing the dark wood grain inside. It had been keeping these secrets longer than my entire second marriage had existed. Target 8. The whole house was dead silent, save for the howling wind outside. It took me a full 20 minutes to crack into that hard drive. As a former structural engineer, I still kept a few digital cracking tools around. By the time the encryption broke and the drive finally loaded onto my MacBook, the clock read 8:02 a.m. There were only 3 folders inside the drive: surveillance footage, asset liquidation, and prey files. I clicked on surveillance footage first. Inside were hundreds of video files, each meticulously labeled with a timestamp and a location tag. Office _07 2318_143. Winecellar_815_842. Garage_9212_1925. The dates went all the way back to July, 4 months ago. I clicked on the first file. My office appeared on the screen. This exact desk. It was an overhead view, tilted at about a 45-degree angle. I watched myself sitting right here, drawing blueprints and answering phone calls. The timestamp showed July 23rd at 2:03 p.m. That was the day I was finalizing a restoration contract for a landmark building downtown. The video had no audio, but the angle was flawless. If you zoomed in, you could clearly see my computer screen, my hands, and everything sitting on the desk. I clicked another file, the wine cellar, August 15th, showing me pouring a glass of bourbon at 11 p.m. Another file, the hallway. September 3rd, showing me walking from the bedroom to the bathroom in a t-shirt and pajama pants. These were old recordings, but the timestamps kept going all through October. The very last file was dated November 4th, which was just 2 days ago. I slowly looked up at the crystal chandelier hanging directly over my head. I had ordered it custom from Europe last year, following Elena's advice to match the classic style of the house. Hidden perfectly among the intricate, sharp cuts of the crystal was a black lens no bigger than a pinhole. I had never even suspected it. It was recording right now. Every conversation I had in this room, every business call about my firm, every single moment I thought I was completely alone. She had heard it and seen it all. For 4 straight months, I forced myself to sit completely still, refusing to react or look directly at the camera. I just closed the video folder and opened the next one. Asset liquidation. This one was packed with spreadsheets, a complete financial breakdown of my life. Vance Architectural Preservation Firm, current valuation based on 2017 audit, $22.6 million. Expected annual growth, 5 to 8%. Stocks and trust funds, $7.2 million. MetLife insurance policy, $5 million. Primary beneficiary changed to Elna Hayes Vance as of March 2015. The notes were color-coded. Green meant liquid assets, yellow meant semi-liquid, and red meant complex transfers. Every single asset had an attached comment. Transfer of company equity requires board approval, but the board exists in name only. 3 members have not participated in actual decisions for 5 years. Can be executed directly through power of attorney signatures. Life insurance beneficiary terms are standard. Payout within 30 days after the death certificate is issued. The coffee on my desk had gone completely cold. Everything I owned, down to the exact terms of my life insurance and the specific vulnerability of my board members, was laid out, plain as day. Reading those notes felt exactly like looking at a demolition blueprint for a building. It wasn't a matter of if it would be torn down, but exactly when and how. If you've ever felt unsafe in your own home, you know it isn't a loud feeling. It's completely silent. It feels like ice water pooling in your chest, spreading slowly until you realize you can't remember the last time you took a deep, easy breath. I closed the laptop. The camera in the chandelier was still rolling. I took the computer, tucked it under my arm, walked out of the office, down the stairs, through the kitchen, and straight into the garage. My black Ford F-150 was parked inside the closed garage. I've driven this truck for 6 years. I climbed into the driver's seat, shut the door, and set the laptop on the steering wheel. It was pitch black inside the garage, lit only by the cold glow of the screen. There were no cameras out here, or at least none that I had seen in the video folders. I opened the third folder, Pray Files. There were 9 PDF documents inside, each one about 10 pages long. I clicked on the very first one, Boston, 2004. George Harrison, 68 years old, retired corporate M&A lawyer, widowed for 3 years. 2 adult daughters living in California, minimal contact. Estimated net worth, $11.4 million. Psychological profile, deeply lonely, desperate for companionship. Makes incredibly reckless decisions once emotionally invested. I clicked on the second one, Miami, 2006. Paul Stern, 61 years old, luxury yacht dealer, divorced, one adult son, estranged relationship. Estimated net worth $8.2 million. Psychological profile, initially highly guarded around women, requires an extended courtship period. Values independence, but harbors a deep-seated craving for partnership. Seattle 2009, Denver 2011, Dallas 2012. Every single file followed the exact same structure: name, age, marital status, net worth, psychological profile, and approach strategy. There were 7 men before me, 7 entire lives cataloged and filed away just like my blueprints. I wondered how many of them were even still alive. The 7th file was marked Atlanta, 2013. The 8th file belonged to me, Chicago, 2014. Richard Vance, 61 years old at initial contact, owner of a boutique architecture firm, widowed in 2015. Late wife Clara suffered a brain aneurysm. Estimated net worth $34.8 million. Psychological profile, absolute trust, completely defenseless if approached correctly. Makes decisions based on emotional narratives rather than financial logic. Values, kindness, and stability above all. Primary weakness, estranged son, David. Richard is desperate for a reconciliation and will drop all defenses for the sake of family harmony. Status, son handled, financial access established. Optimal closure window, within 24 to 36 months. Handled. There it was, those 7 cold characters staring back at me from the screen. My own son reduced to nothing more than a checked box on someone's checklist. I shut the laptop and just sat there in the darkness of my truck. Snow was starting to pile up on the garage roof, making a heavy, muffled, rustling sound. It was the kind of Chicago blizzard that you knew was going to stick around for days. Elena's flight was scheduled to land at 6 p.m. She would be walking through the front door by 7. That gave me less than 5 hours to figure out exactly who I was going to be when she pushed that door open. Was I going to be the man who just discovered his entire life was a monitored cage and a line item on a balance sheet? Or was I going to be the husband who cups his wife's face, smiles, and asks, "How was Miami?" I sat there in my pickup, inside that sealed garage, balancing the laptop on the steering wheel. I caught my own reflection in the rearview mirror. A 65-year-old man who had just learned he'd been living under complete surveillance for the last 4 months. I needed to decide, right then and there, whether I was going to scream or whether I was going to think. I chose to think. That meant the very first thing I had to do was find a way to blind her 4-month-old surveillance network without letting her know I was onto her. At 10:15 a.m., I climbed out of the truck and walked back into the house. I went through the kitchen, up the stairs, and passed right by the office doors, without giving that crystal chandelier a single glance. The Wi-Fi router was at the very end of the hallway, inside a linen closet, tucked away behind some heavy winter coats. It was just a little black box with 4 blinking green lights. I pulled the power cord straight out, counted all the way to 60, and plugged it back in. 60 seconds. Long enough to force every hidden camera to reset its connection, but short enough to look like a standard network glitch. If she ever checked the router logs later, it would just look like the internet had acted up. When a Chicago blizzard hits, losing your connection is completely normal. I had about a 10-minute window before the entire system would come back online and start recording again. I went back into the office, sat down at my desk, and pulled out my phone. I scrolled through my contacts until I found a name I hadn't dialed in almost 2 years. Thomas Reynolds. We met back in 2015 at a security assessment conference for historic buildings. He was a retired IRS criminal investigation special agent who spent 30 years tracking money, laundering, and financial fraud. We kept in touch occasionally over email. I had even sent him a wedding announcement when I married Elena. He only sent back a short, simple note. "Congratulations, be happy." I pressed the call button. Thomas Reynolds, now 67 years old, picked up on the 3rd ring. His voice was completely calm, carrying that professional tone of someone who had spent 3 decades listening to people describe the absolute worst things imaginable. Richard Vance, he said, probably looking at his caller ID. It's been a while. What's going on? I need your help, Thomas. I just found something and I can't even bring myself to believe it's real. There was silence. It wasn't an empty silence, but the kind that tells you the person on the other end is locked in, giving you their full attention. Go ahead, he said. I laid out everything I had found. The grandfather clock, the hidden compartment, the 3 passports with my wife's face but different names, and the American passport with her real name but the wrong birth year. The list where I was typed out as target number 8, complete with a note, absolute trust, weakness, son, handled. The solid-state drive filled with surveillance footage dating back to July, hundreds of video files covering the office, the wine cellar, and the hallways. The asset valuation that went down to the exact terms of my life insurance policy, and the psychological profiles of the 7 men who came before me. I kept my voice perfectly level, leaving out any emotion and just sticking to the facts. Thomas never interrupted. There was only that dead, professional silence on the line, the sound of a man mentally filing away evidence into separate folders. When I finally finished talking, he let out a slow, heavy breath. How many cameras? He asked. At least 4, maybe more. How many victims total on that list? 10, 7 before me and 2 after. What's the total value of the assets they cataloged? I closed my eyes. Over $30 million. He sighed again. Richard, this is a textbook marriage-based asset fraud ring. It's systematic, and it's highly professional. You aren't the first, and you definitely won't be the last. If you've ever had to ask for help after realizing your whole life was a lie, you know that the hardest part is saying the very first words out loud, because once you say them, it makes it real, and hearing someone else confirm it makes it a permanent scar you can never erase. What do I do? I asked. First things first, do not confront her. Do not change a single detail of your daily routine. Tonight at dinner, you don't even change the rhythm of how you breathe. From this exact second forward, everything you do is evidence for a courtroom. If she gets suspicious, she will either speed up her timeline or vanish into thin air with your money. We need her to believe you are still that absolutely trusting, Richard. Absolutely trusting. They really had me pegged. How am I supposed to act normal? I asked. You've been married for 4 years. You know the drill. You smile when she walks through the door. You ask how Miami was. You listen to her complain about how boring the forum was. You don't ask a single question you wouldn't have asked yesterday. You do not mention the grandfather clock, the hidden compartment, or the hard drive. And then we gather the real evidence. Bank records, travel history, background checks on every single one of those identities. We find out if those 7 men before you are even still alive. We follow the money trail. We build a case that proves a pattern and criminal intent. How long is that going to take? It depends on how careful she is. Could be days, could be weeks. But Richard, listen to me closely. At our age, cheating and betrayal aren't emotional mistakes anymore. They are a precise accounting calculation. She isn't acting on feelings. She's running on a timeline. Every single thing she does is calculated. Every smile, every touch, every single conversation about your health, your business, or your son. It's all part of a massive architecture. At our age, betrayal isn't a mistake. It's an accounting calculation. Those words pressed down on my chest like cold metal. What do you need from me? I asked. Thomas paused for a second, and I could hear the sound of paper shuffling and the click of a ballpoint pen. I need 2 things immediately. First, Elena's flight itineraries for the past 6 months. Every single trip she took, including dates and destinations. Second, the name of the art appraisal or auction company she claims to work for. The one that keeps sending her to Miami and all those other cities. I can get all of that, I said. We have a shared calendar, and I have the email receipts. Good. Get it to me before the day ends, but only if you can do it without being obvious. Do not go searching through her computer. Do not dig through her drawers. Only use the stuff you normally have access to. What exactly are you looking for? Patterns, vulnerabilities, meeting dates that don't match up with real events, or trips to cities where there weren't even any industry events happening. If this is the kind of operation I think it is, her travel records won't line up with a legitimate job at all. They're going to line up with something else entirely. I understood immediately. The first 7 victims on that list: Boston 2004, Miami 2006, Seattle 2009. You think she's still in touch with them? I asked. Or she's in touch with the executors of their estates, Thomas said quietly. Richard, I'm truly sorry. I know this isn't the conversation you want to have when you called me. No, I replied, but it's exactly what I needed to hear. Before hanging up, Thomas went over the 2 requests one more time. His voice had shifted from sympathy to a cold, objective sharpness. I recognized that shift. It was the sound of a formal criminal investigation starting up. I had full access to both pieces of information, and suddenly I realized exactly what Thomas was trying to find. By 3:47 p.m., I sent Thomas everything he asked for. 14 separate flight records spanning the past 8 months, pulled directly from our shared iCloud family calendar, along with the name of the firm Elna worked for, Olympus Art Valuation Trusts. All this data came from places she never bothered to hide. Our shared calendar synced automatically to both of our phones. Her flight receipts were even set up to forward, straight to our joint email account for household bookkeeping. She never kept her business trips a secret. Why would she? I had never given her a reason to. A gallery director flying out for an art form made perfect, logical sense. But sitting there in the office looking over the list now, the pattern looked entirely different. 14 flights in 8 months, 4 trips to Seattle, 3 to Denver, 2 to Miami, 2 to Boston, and 1 each to Houston, Austin, and San Francisco. The Seattle trips were always Tuesday through Thursday. The Denver trips always included a weekend. The Miami trips were always short, never lasting more than 2 days. I had always assumed she was just incredibly busy with work. I never once questioned why an appraisal director needed to fly around that much. I exported the calendar files, copied the email receipts, and sent Thomas the link to the official website for Olympus Art. It was a registered business out of Denver, established 3 years ago, specializing in high-end private collection valuations and transactions. The website looked flawless, like a completely real professional company. I clicked send. The office felt even colder than it had this morning. Thomas would find the pattern. Deep down, I already knew what he was going to uncover. The names on the list: Seattle 2009, Miami 2006, Boston 2004. Those cities weren't random. They were hunting grounds. They represented past victims, or current prey. At 6 p.m., I went downstairs to start dinner. I cooked steak, medium rare, paired with asparagus and rosemary potatoes, exactly the way she liked it. It was routine, completely normal. The kitchen filled with the rich aroma of butter and thyme. As I flipped the steaks in the pan, I checked my phone. It was an email from Thomas. The subject line read, "Need to speak immediately." Standing by the kitchen counter with the metal tongs still in my hand, I opened the email. It was short, carrying a clinical, bone-chilling coldness. 4 paragraphs, reading like an autopsy report, completely dissecting my marriage. The first paragraph stated that Olympus Art was nothing but a shell company. Their website listed all scheduled art forms for the year, but there were absolutely no events held in Seattle during March, June, or September, the exact months Elena had flown there. The Denver forms were real, but the dates completely clashed with her itinerary. Thomas wrote plainly, "She isn't going there for work, Richard. She is going there to see them." The second paragraph detailed the background check on the passport names. Sophie Levine, the name on the French passport, was currently engaged to a man named Charles Cavendish. Charles was a 68-year-old retired Silicon Valley tech executive and a widower. A Seattle Society column had published their engagement announcement in April 2018, complete with a photograph. The third paragraph revealed that Emma Wilson, the identity on the Australian passport, was currently living in Denver with William Brennan, a 71-year-old commercial real estate developer. Property records showed that as of January 2018, she had been added as a co-owner of William's primary residence. The fourth paragraph confirmed bank records for an account opened under the name Carmen Lopez in Boston. It was opened 14 months ago with a current balance of $3.8 million. The funds had been systematically moved through small, frequent deposits over a long period. It was a highly professional money laundering technique. Right below the text was an attachment. It was the engagement photo from the social section of the Seattle Times, dated April 14th, 2018. I clicked it open. Elena was wearing a deep burgundy gown I had never seen before, standing next to a gray-haired man in a tailored suit, smiling beautifully. Charles Cavendish had his arm wrapped around her waist, and on the ring finger of her left hand was a massive diamond ring. It was completely different from the one she wore with me. The caption underneath read, "Mr. Charles Cavendish and his fiancée, Miss Sophie Levine, are delighted to announce their engagement. Trust doesn't shatter all at once. It unravels in stages. First, you discover they lied. Then you realize how deep the lie actually goes. Finally, it hits you that you've been looking at a complete stranger the entire time." I set the phone face up on the counter. The steaks were still sizzling in the pan. I used the tongs to flip them over, watching the edges caramelize under the high heat. 3 names, 3 men, 3 parallel lives running at the exact same time. While I was staying up late in Chicago, staring at structural blueprints to fix a load-bearing wall for a historic preservation project, and worrying about stone supplier delivery times, she was wearing a burgundy gown in Seattle, planning a wedding with a tech executive. While I was brewing coffee on freezing winter mornings, she was sharing ownership of a luxury estate in Denver with a real estate mogul. While she was supposed to be away on business trips, leaving me to sleep alone in our bed, she was building an entire life with someone else. Someone else. More than one person. At 7:15 p.m., I turned off the stove. The steaks were done. I didn't plate them. I just stood there, staring into the pan as the steam rose, leaving the red wine unopened on the counter. My phone buzzed, a text from Elena. It read, "Flight delayed, getting in late. Did you save some potatoes for me?" I stared at that message for 2 full minutes. Did you save some potatoes for me? The tone was so completely natural, as if we were still the same loving couple we had been this morning. As if she were still the same woman who kissed my cheek before leaving for Miami 4 days ago. As if I were still the gullible man who believed her excuses about an art forum running late. Thomas's voice echoed in my head, reminding me not to change my routine, not to alter the rhythm of my breathing, because everything from now on was evidence. I typed out a 2-letter reply. Okay. It was the first time in our 4 years of marriage, even including our time dating, that I had intentionally lied to her. I never had a reason to lie before. I never wanted to. A marriage is supposed to be the one place where you don't have to act. But she had been acting the entire time, and now I was an actor too. Okay. Those 2 letters, which I had typed thousands of times before, felt as heavy as concrete tonight. I pressed send. The message marked as delivered, then changed to read. 3 little dots started dancing on the screen. She was typing. Then the dots vanished. No reply. I flipped the phone face down on the counter and looked around the kitchen. The now cold steaks, the unopened wine, the chopped asparagus waiting to be cooked. On the laptop, the email remained open, showing the woman named Sophie in her burgundy gown, next to a man whose name I had only learned 10 minutes ago. The house felt entirely different. It wasn't because she wasn't in it. I had spent plenty of nights alone while she was traveling, and back then the house always felt like it was waiting for her to return. Tonight, the silence was different, because I finally understood that she had never actually belonged here. Sophie in Seattle was real. Emma in Denver was real. But the woman who was coming back to Chicago tonight, the one who slept in my bed and asked if I saved her some potatoes, I had no idea what kind of monster she actually was. And she was coming home tonight. At 11:47 p.m. that night, I called my son. I did it because I couldn't carry the weight of this secret alone anymore, and because the sudden realization that I had been watched for 4 months made our past distance feel incredibly foolish. Elena had made it home by 10:15 p.m. She rolled her suitcase into the kitchen, set her bag down, and smiled at me as if nothing were wrong, complaining about how exhausted she was. I nodded and asked how Miami went. She microwaved the cold steak, leaning against the counter while eating and venting about a difficult art broker at the Forum. I listened, nodded along, and asked a follow-up question right on cue. It was a perfect display of normal behavior, exactly as Thomas had instructed. She went upstairs to bed at 10:45 p.m. I stayed behind in the office with the door shut and the lights off. At 11:47 p.m., I pulled up David's number in New York. David Vance, my 33-year-old son, worked as a forensic accountant on Wall Street. He picked up on the very first ring, almost as if he had been sitting by his phone waiting for this exact call for 4 months. "Dad," he said. It wasn't a question, just a heavy sigh of relief. "David, I know it's incredibly late. Dad, you found something, didn't you?" he interrupted. Finally. That single word hit me like hard evidence. "How long have you suspected something?" I asked. 6 months, Dad. I noticed some transactions that didn't make any sense. They were deeply hidden, but when you added them up, things didn't track. I sat back in my chair. "What kind of transactions?" "Back in May, you called me and mentioned taking out a new mortgage on the North Shore house to free up some liquidity for a company expansion. Out of professional habit, I asked you for some specifics. But when I went to check the public property records later, the mortgage had actually been approved 2 months earlier than you told me, and the loan amount was $500,000 higher than what you said." I had absolutely no memory of that conversation. Elena had been the one handling all the paperwork for the home equity lines. I reached out to a colleague who specializes in financial fraud investigations, David continued, and we started pulling public records, title transfers, and corporate filings. It was all small discrepancies, but they formed a clear pattern. So I tried calling you. You called me 17 times, Dad, between May and September. Every single time Elena answered the phone. She always told me you were incredibly busy, or in a meeting, or reviewing blueprints, and she promised you'd call me back. You never called back once. That familiar feeling of ice water pouring into my chest returned. "I never received a single message," I said. "I know. I figured that out around July. So I started sending emails and text messages. Whoever was replying would write back, but the tone was completely wrong. It was too formal, way too brief. At one point, I sent a test text asking about Mom's antique grandfather clock in the office. The reply stated that you had sold it to an antique dealer months ago. "I never sold it," I said. "It was sitting against the office wall until yesterday morning." I know. That was the exact moment I knew for a fact she was intercepting everything. She was monitoring your communications and replying as you, entirely to cut me out of your life. When you realize your own child has been actively protecting you, rather than you protecting him, you don't feel a surge of love. You feel like an absolute failure. "Then why didn't you just fly out to Chicago and confront me face to face?" I asked. "Because I knew that without ironclad proof, you would never believe me. You loved her. You trusted her completely. If I had just shown up at your front door out of nowhere with a stack of public records, accusing your wife of being a con artist, you would have thought I was just jealous, or that I was trying to protect my inheritance. You had to see it with your own eyes." He was completely right. If this had happened a week ago, I would have defended Elena without a second thought. "So I waited," David said. "I kept investigating from the shadows, praying that you would notice a crack somewhere, something that would make you reach out to me. I found it," I told him. I laid out the whole story about the grandfather clock, the hidden compartment, the passports, the target list, the encrypted hard drive, and the 3 parallel lives that Thomas had uncovered. David listened in total silence, never breaking in. When I finally finished, there was a long pause on the line. "Dad, I'm flying to Chicago tomorrow morning," he said. "Do not tell her I'm coming." We hung up at 12:43 a.m. I sat there in the dark, thinking about those 17 phone calls I never knew about, and the text messages sent in my name that I had never written. The next day, which was Wednesday afternoon, Elena left the house around 1 p.m. to go to the gallery, saying she had a mountain of appraisal paperwork to catch up on. She kissed my cheek on her way out the door. I waited until her car completely disappeared around the corner of the street, and then I walked out toward the backyard. Hector Martinez, a 61-year-old, who had been my quiet, reliable groundskeeper and driver for over a decade, was standing in the garage. There was a heavy, uncharacteristic silence about him that made it clear he was carrying a massive secret. He was washing my F-150, the deep black paint gleaming under the harsh garage lights and streaming water. "Hector," I said, breaking the silence, "have you noticed anything unusual around the house with Elena lately?" He stopped wiping the truck, lowered his rag, and just stared at me for a long time. It was that specific silence of his, the kind that meant he was carefully choosing his words before speaking. Finally, he walked over to the garage storage locker and came back holding a small black external backup hard drive. "She thought I formatted the home security server," Hector said. "I didn't." He handed the drive to me. The metal casing felt cold, surprisingly heavy for its size. "What's on here?" I asked. 3 months of security footage backups, mostly the backyard and the hallways. She told me to clear the server back in September, because the storage space was getting full. I told her it was taken care of, but I kept a copy for myself. "Why?" I asked. Hector's hands were shaking slightly. It was the very first time I had ever seen him lose his absolute composure. "Because I saw her," he replied. "July 14th, August 3rd, September 22nd. The exact same pattern every time. 2 o'clock in the morning. She would walk into your office. I watched it happen on the secondary monitor in the garage. She was using her phone flashlight to take photos of the blueprints and the paperwork on your desk. I wanted to tell you so many times, but I figured, who is going to believe a gardener accusing the master of the house's wife?" Hector had been watching this happen in total silence for 3 months, trapped between his loyalty to me and sheer fear. "I'm sorry, sir," he whispered. "I should have spoken up sooner." Hector handed over the black drive, turned back toward the truck, and went back to wiping down the hood, his weathered hands tracing smooth, steady circles across the dark paint. I just stood there, gripping 3 months of undeniable proof in my hand. Timestamps at 2:17 a.m. My wife's silhouette right at the office doorway, the camera capturing her bent over my desk, flipping through my personal files by the dim glow of her phone screen. The person closest to me had been tracking her, while I had been completely blind to everything, and Elena had absolutely no idea that all the evidence had been saved. She made it home at 7:14 p.m. that Wednesday evening. I heard the familiar double tap of her brakes as she pulled into the driveway. In the past, that sound used to bring me a wave of comfort. Now I knew exactly where she had really been. I stood by the kitchen counter prepping dinner. The drive Hector gave me was locked away safely in the glove box of my truck. The evidence was piling up high, the passports, the target list, Thomas's investigation, David's 6 months of tracking, and now Hector's 2 a.m. security footage. Every single arrow pointed toward the exact same chilling conclusion. And now she was pushing the door open. Elena came in through the side door, rolling her small black suitcase, the same one she always used. She was wearing dark trousers, a white silk shirt, and had her hair tied back. She looked completely exhausted. Was it real exhaustion or just part of the act? I couldn't even tell the difference anymore. "Hey, babe," she said, setting her bag down. Traffic coming from the airport was an absolute nightmare. She walked across the kitchen and kissed my cheek. It was quick and mechanical, the standard routine of a 4-year marriage. Her lips felt cool against my skin. She carried the faint smell of recycled airplane air mixed with her usual expensive jasmine perfume. For the very first time, I noticed that her smile never actually reached her eyes. "How was your week?" she asked, already walking over to the counter to sort through a stack of mail I had left there. "How was the art forum in Miami?" I countered. "Long. Way too many boring breakout sessions, and the coffee was terrible. You know how those things go." I did know, or at least I thought I did. But there was no forum in Seattle, and Denver only had a real estate mogul named William Brennan and a live-in girlfriend named Emma. I turned back to chopping onions, lowering the heat on the stove. "You must be starving," I said. "Starving is an understatement. Those tiny airplane nuts don't count as food." She started unpacking her things on the kitchen island. Her laptop, the form folders, business cards, an insulated travel mug. It was the mechanical movement of someone who had practiced this exact routine hundreds of times. But now I was watching those exact movements, looking for the cracks. She kept talking as she cleaned up. She mentioned the appraisal agency was restructuring its vendor network. She complained that her flight yesterday had been stuck on the tarmac for 2 hours, and the hotel Wi-Fi was so terrible that checking her emails was a massive chore. I listened to her excuses while plating dinner and setting the dishes on the table. Her phone buzzed face down on the counter. She glanced at it, left it there, and kept right on complaining about the hotel internet. I didn't look at the screen, and I didn't ask who was calling. We sat down to eat. "That charity auction downtown next week," she said, poking at a piece of meat with her fork. "Did you take care of the corporate sponsor directory?" "Everything is completely settled," I said. "The sponsorship agreements are signed, and the booth space is confirmed." She visibly relaxed, her shoulders dropping about half an inch. For the first time since she walked through the door, her smile actually reached her eyes. "Perfect," she said. "This event is huge. National exposure, lots of top-tier connections. The annual Historical Preservation and Art Auction Gala. November 14th, just 8 days away. Thomas had mentioned it over the phone, too. There would be more than 400 prominent politicians and business leaders attending. It was a massive event on the Chicago social calendar. I watched her hand gestures as she spoke, looking at the excitement on her face as she described the keynote speaker lineup. I suddenly realized I was looking at two entirely different people at the exact same time. The wife who made me laugh at a charity gala 4 years ago, the woman I chose to marry, and the woman named Sophie who was currently engaged to a tech giant out in Seattle. It was a blurred, double image that I couldn't bring into focus. If you've ever looked at someone you love deeply, only to suddenly see a complete stranger hiding beneath a familiar mask, you know exactly what it feels like. It isn't a loud, crashing realization. It's a dead, heavy silence, like a permanent shadow you can't shake off. "Are you okay?" she asked. "You seem kind of distracted." "Just a little tired," I said. "Work has been pretty overwhelming the last few days. Well, I'm back home now." She reached across the table and took my hand, her fingers feeling warm. "We'll have a nice, relaxing weekend. How about we go to that Italian place you love on Saturday?" "Sure," I said. "Sounds great." Her phone buzzed again. This time she picked it up, glanced at the screen, and placed it right back, face down. "Work?" I asked. "Just the airline," she replied. "Confirmation email for my next trip." I didn't ask where she was going or when. I just nodded and took a bite of my potatoes. We finished dinner in a comfortable silence. The kind of silence that usually means two people have been together long enough that they don't need to fill the empty space with mindless chatter. But tonight, that silence tasted entirely different. We were both just acting out comfort instead of actually living it. She helped me clear the table, rinsing the plates and loading them into the dishwasher. Everything was in its place, perfectly practiced. "I'm going to go take a shower," she said, wiping her hands on a towel. "The travel really takes it out of you. Take your time." She left her suitcase by the door and her phone charging on the counter, then headed upstairs. I heard the bathroom door click shut, followed by the sound of running water. I stood there in the kitchen, listening to the water rushing through the pipes. Over the last 4 years, I had heard that exact sound thousands of times. It used to mean my wife was safe at home, representing familiarity, a daily routine, and the security of marriage. Tonight, it sounded like someone actively washing the evidence off their hands, like someone trying to wash away Seattle, Denver, and Miami, washing away Charles, William, the $3.8 million account, and 3 passports with different names. I thought about Hector's security footage, that silhouette of her at 2:17 a.m., using her phone flashlight to rifle through the documents on my office desk. She did it with the exact same methodical care she used to wash the dishes just moments ago. The water kept running upstairs. It was the sound of a person washing away one life before stepping right back into another. I looked at the phone sitting on the counter. The screen was dark, the charging light blinking green. She left it there just like she always did. She trusted me not to look. She trusted that I was still that completely defenseless prey. I didn't touch it. The water upstairs finally stopped. I heard the shower door slide open, followed by the rustle of her drying off. All the familiar sounds I had heard countless times before. But tonight, my head was completely filled with the image of her sneaking into my office in the middle of the night. The bathroom door opened, and warm steam drifted out into the hallway. I realized right then that I was about to spend the night in the exact same bed with a person who spent her midnights taking photos of my financial records while I slept. There were 8 days left until that charity auction gala. I had to figure out exactly how to keep playing my part. I managed to survive that night, sleeping just 3 feet away from a person who had spent months inventorying my life like a liquidator, counting stock. By Thursday morning, I was parking my truck in the short-term lot at O'Hare International Airport, heading in to pick up the only person who had actually tried to warn me. The night had gone exactly as I expected. Dead, heavy, and completely suffocating. Elena fell asleep around 10:30 p.m., her breathing falling into the steady rhythm I had listened to for 4 years. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying Hector's footage over and over in my head, wondering if she was going to get out of bed again. She didn't. She slept incredibly soundly while I watched the hours tick away until dawn. At 6 a.m. she kissed me goodbye, mentioning she had an early morning meeting downtown at the gallery. I waited a full 12 minutes after her car cleared the driveway before hitting the road myself. By 9:47 a.m., I watched David walk out of the security terminal, a black briefcase slung over his shoulder. He looked a bit thinner than I remembered, dressed in the standard uniform of a New York professional, a dark overcoat and a sharply tailored suit. But the moment his eyes found mine, the corporate mask completely dropped, and he was just my son again. We hadn't hugged in 4 years. He held on to me tightly, and that solid, real embrace was something a phone call could never replicate. "It's been 4 months, Dad," he whispered. "I'm sorry I didn't get here sooner." "You tried 17 times, I replied. We walked out to the F-150 in silence, throwing his bag into the back seat. I pulled out of the lot and drove toward downtown, heading to a temporary office space that Thomas had rented with cash just yesterday, a secure spot with absolutely no surveillance. "She told me you were too wrapped up in work to bother with your old man," I said as I merged onto Interstate 90. David stared out the window at the gray Chicago sky. "The second you stopped returning my calls, I knew something was wrong. That wasn't you. It never was. Even when Mom was at her worst, you always returned my calls. I never got a single message." "I know. When the calls kept getting blocked and the text replies started sounding incredibly cold, I went ahead and hired a private investigator. He brought up that casual conversation about the mortgage back in May. Out of professional curiosity, he had run a check on the public property records. The refinancing loan had been approved 2 months earlier than you told me, and the amount was $500,000 higher. It was a tiny discrepancy," he noted, "and on its own it might not have meant much, but it made me start digging deeper. Once you start digging into something like that, the pattern completely takes over." At 10:28 a.m., we pulled into the parking lot of the temporary office building. Up on the second floor, Thomas was already waiting for us. His laptop was open, and the desk was completely covered in files and documents. "David," Thomas said, standing up to shake his hand, "your father told me about your line of work. Forensic accountant on Wall Street." "7 years now," David replied, "mainly handling trust fraud, money laundering structures, and tracking shell companies." "Then you are definitely going to recognize this setup." Thomas turned the laptop screen around to face us. There it was, right on the screen, a 2004 internal file from the Chicago Police Department. "Elena Hayes," Thomas said. "Back in 2004, she was the subject of an internal investigation for financial fraud, targeting a wealthy, widowed Chicago businessman. The case was completely buried. No charges, no convictions. But that businessman ended up losing every single piece of property he owned in a series of supposedly legitimate foreclosures. The timeline is absolutely buried in red flags." Thomas paused for a second, letting the weight of it sink in. "Elena Hayes. That is her real name, and this is her hometown. She's been right here the entire time, Richard." I stared at the screen. A Chicago address. A local high school listed in the background report. Elena had grown up less than 20 miles from where I was sitting right now. The investigation just faded away, Thomas continued. No formal charges, and the businessman lost everything. Where did she go after that? I asked. In 2005, Elena Hayes completely vanished on paper. No death certificate, no forwarding address, nothing. Then, 6 months later, Carmen Lopez magically appears down in Miami. She has a perfectly clean background, a different social security number, and flawless credit. Financial fraud at this level is all about isolation. They cut you off from your kids, isolate you, and then they make their move from the shadows, David said, studying the file. Someone helped her scrub her past and build these new identities from scratch. Manufacturing clean profiles with this level of professional detail takes a massive amount of money, connections, and expertise. Thomas nodded, pulling up another document on his screen. And here is the bridge connecting all of those identities. Marcus Thorne. He slid a photo across the desk. It was a crisp, professional headshot of a man in his early 50s, with graying temples, wearing an expensive tailored suit. Delaware LLC filings listed him as the registered agent for an entity called Olympus Holding Group. Marcus Thorne, age 53, Thomas said. He shows up as the registered agent on the shell company filings for every single fake identity Elena has ever used. Never charged, never convicted, but his name is always lurking right there, buried so deep you'd never find it unless you were explicitly looking for it. David leaned forward, pulling the photo closer to his face. His expression completely changed. I know this guy, David said. Thomas and I both looked at him at the exact same time. What do you mean? I asked. I know this man, Marcus Thorne. He's tied to a case I'm actively working on right now in New York. David quickly pulled out his phone, scrolling rapidly through his screen. He found what he was looking for and turned the screen toward us. It was the exact same face, the exact same man, a different photo, but there was absolutely no mistaking it. A retired aerospace executive. David's voice was completely tight. 71 years old. Lost $4 million last year in a fraudulent trust restructuring scheme. We've been investigating it for 8 months. Marcus Thorne's name was buried deep in the shell company registration papers, but he vanished right before we could hit the discovery phase of the lawsuit. We thought he was just a broker, or a middleman. David pointed a finger at Thomas's documents, the target list, or the timelines, and the patterns. But this isn't an isolated incident, Dad. Marcus isn't just helping Elena. Elena is actively working for Marcus. I know this guy. Those 4 words completely shifted the ground beneath us. David flipped his laptop open and pulled up the active files from the New York case. A retired executive, 71 years old, trust fraud, the exact same shell company framework, the exact same timeline pattern, the exact same signature from Marcus Thorne, buried deep within the LLC paperwork, mirroring perfectly what Thomas had just uncovered in my own case. He looked up at Thomas and then over at me. How many other people are behind this? He asked. How many victims did they manufacture before they decided to target my dad? Thomas slowly closed his laptop. I'm going to find out first thing tomorrow morning, he said. David had scheduled an appointment with a neurotoxicologist for Thursday afternoon at 2 o'clock. When he first asked me to bring a sample of the specific bourbon cocktail Elena personally mixed for me every single night before bed, I thought he was just being paranoid. But the second the doctor finished testing that liquid, the look on his face changed entirely. Thomas stayed behind at the temporary office to keep digging into Marcus Thorne's network. David drove me toward the Chicago Medical District in a rental car with a small vial of the liquid sitting in a sealed evidence bag right between us in the cup holder. That drink was my nightly nightcap. Elena always told me it contained a special, expensive herbal extract she brought back from Europe. For 2 straight years, every single night at 11 p.m., we would sit by the living room fireplace while she asked how my day went. I would drink the cocktail and then I would fall into a deep, heavy sleep. Dr. Chen, an independent toxicologist in his late 40s, looked at the vial with the guarded, cautious expression of someone who had seen far too many poisoning cases. He started by drawing my blood, a standard draw, 3 full vials. Then he took my liquid sample and disappeared into the lab. David and I sat in the examination room, neither of us saying a word. What was there to say? We were waiting to find out if my wife was systematically poisoning me. She either was or she wasn't. Either way, the marriage was already dead. 20 minutes later, Dr. Chen walked back into the room, holding a printed report and the sealed evidence bag. The blood work shows traceable amounts of alprazolam and an incredibly high dose of beta blockers, he said, placing the paperwork flat on the desk. A single dose isn't fatal, but consistent. Long-term ingestion will cause severe cognitive effects. This is prescription-grade anti-anxiety sedation and blood pressure medication. What about the drink? David asked. Dr. Chen pointed directly to the lab analysis. The cocktail has been deliberately spiked with an incredibly precise dosage of these medications. It's completely dissolved and perfectly uniform, meaning there is absolutely no way this was accidental contamination. It was carefully measured and mixed in. I stared blankly at the flash drive. That was the exact thing that had been draining my encrypted files every single day since July. For 4 months, I had sat right across the dinner table from her, completely oblivious that every word I spoke was being recorded by her own hands, thanking her for being so supportive before kissing her goodnight. If I stop drinking this today, I asked, forcing my voice to stop shaking, will my memory and my mental clarity come back? Dr. Chen paused for a brief moment. The long-term effects of this specific drug combination are entirely reversible. If you stop taking it right now, then yes. The severe fatigue, the mild forgetfulness, the delayed reactions, those symptoms should completely clear up within a few weeks. How long do you have to administer this before you start seeing clear clinical symptoms? David asked. Taking this specific dose consistently will produce the exact symptoms you described within 4 to 6 months. Mild fatigue, slowed cognitive function, occasionally forgetting small details. Nothing dramatic enough to cause an emergency room visit, but just enough to easily read as mild cognitive impairment on a medical chart. Early stage dementia. Every single night, every drink she handed me since July, I drank every last drop. Elder medical abuse is entirely invisible. There are no bruises, no broken bones, just a nightly cocktail handed to you by the person you love most in the world. The symptoms you're describing, Dr. Chen continued, looking over my initial intake charts, the forgetfulness, the fatigue, the foggy mornings, that is exactly what a long-term, low-dose mixture of sedatives does. And that is exactly the kind of documented behavior needed to manufacture a paper trail for early cognitive decline. I went to see my primary care physician back in September, I noted, Dr. Aris. He asked me about my memory. He just went through a few routine questions, jotted down some notes, but he never scheduled any actual testing. Did he recommend a follow-up neurological evaluation? Dr. Chen asked. No, he just told me to keep an eye on it. Told me to come back if things started getting worse. David's jaw clenched tightly, his hands tightening into fists against his legs. Dr. Chen finished writing out his diagnostic conclusions, handed me an official copy, and carefully sealed the liquid sample back into the evidence bag, signing and dating the seal. Keep this, he said quietly. You're definitely going to need this for any future legal proceedings. By 3:15 p.m., we left the clinic and drove back to the temporary office in complete silence. David's knuckles were stark white against the steering wheel. Thomas was already waiting for us when we walked back in with a fresh stack of files spread out across the desk. Bank statements, medical records, and a massive spreadsheet systematically mapping out my entire life. Dr. Aris, Thomas said the second we stepped through the door. On August 12th, a wire transfer for $25,000 went directly from a Delaware LLC into his personal bank account. It used the exact same shell company framework favored by Marcus Thorne. I slowly sat down in a chair. That was a full month before my follow-up appointment, I said. Thomas nodded. On September 17th, Dr. Aris logged a preliminary diagnosis into your official medical file. It reads, suspected mild cognitive impairment, based on a 15-minute clinical consultation. No brain scans, no professional cognitive tests, Not even a referral for a second opinion. He based it entirely on observation and self-reported symptoms. David pulled a chair over and flipped his laptop open. "This is their endgame, Dad," he said, his voice dropping into that cold, precise tone he used for courtrooms. "If Elena can prove you are cognitively impaired, even just on paper, she can petition a court for an involuntary conservatorship. She has medical evidence from your long-term family physician stating you have mild cognitive impairment, visible symptoms, and a documented history of forgetfulness." "But I don't have cognitive impairment," I said, my voice rising. "It doesn't matter. She has a signed note from a doctor stating that you might. She also has 4 months of documented fatigue and slowed behavior caused by the sedatives you've been taking. Anyone observing you would see an aging man stepping right into the early stages of dementia." Thomas leaned forward across the desk. "Once a court grants a conservatorship based on that medical evidence, she doesn't need your signature anymore, Richard. She becomes your legal representative, signing everything on your behalf. Title transfers, selling company equity, emptying bank accounts, everything. She signs for you. Legally, you become completely incapacitated. The court will automatically assume she is acting in your absolute best interest," David added, "protecting you from making a terrible mistake while you aren't of sound mind. But in reality, she isn't protecting you at all. She gains the legal power to completely liquidate everything you own." I thought back to the asset valuation spreadsheets hidden on that encrypted drive. Every single bank account, every piece of property, every single share of stock had an attached note detailing transfer mechanisms and access protocols. "How long does it take to secure a conservatorship like that?" I asked. "If she files for an emergency temporary conservatorship, claiming your condition is deteriorating rapidly, she could get a temporary order within a matter of days," David said. "A formal hearing would follow within a month. Has she filed yet?" "Not yet. I've been monitoring the court system," David replied. "The medical paperwork is completely lined up. The poisoning is still ongoing. She is actively laying the foundation." Thomas tapped his pen against Dr. Aris's bank statement. "She's waiting for a specific moment, a trigger event, or a precise date on the calendar. It might be that charity auction gala next week. Once that event wraps up, she will likely accelerate the entire timeline." I sat there in that temporary office, staring at the cocktail bottle David had taken from my kitchen. It was the exact thing Elena prepared for me every single night. The bottle looked completely innocent and familiar. It hit me right then that when I went home tonight, she was going to pour me another glass, and I was going to have to drink it, while pretending absolutely nothing was wrong. By 6:30 Thursday evening, David and I were sitting in a hidden corner booth of a quiet cafe down in the River North district. I needed to show him something that I couldn't risk exposing anywhere near a camera, and I absolutely had to figure out what those 7 characters really meant. Handled. Target Gaudu. I had exactly 3 hours before I needed to be home. Elena believed I was out at a suburban project site managing an unexpected engineering emergency. It was the very first major lie I had told her since discovering the truth. The cafe was practically deserted. We sat tucked away in the back booth as the snow began to fall again outside the window. David ordered a black coffee, while I didn't order anything at all. I slid the printed list of victims across the middle of the table, placing my finger directly on the 8th line. Target 8. Richard Vance, Chicago, 2014. Absolute trust. Completely defenseless if approached correctly. Weakness. Son. Handled. David read it once, then read it again. His fingers tightened around his coffee mug, his knuckles turning stark white from the pressure. "Handled," he muttered, his voice dropping to a low whisper, like a file to be processed, a transaction that's already closed. He looked up at me, and his face carried an expression I couldn't entirely read. There was pure anger, deep sorrow, and a strange sense of relief, as if a suspicion he'd been carrying for a very long time had finally been validated. "Dad," he said, "I need to show you something. These are text messages you sent me last year." "David, I don't remember sending you any texts last year. Elena always told me you were just too busy to bother with me." "I know, that was the whole point. He pulled out his phone, his hand shaking slightly, and turned the screen toward me. It was a log of text messages sent directly from my number to his phone. They ran from March all the way through July. 17 messages in total. I read the first one. David, I need some space. You're interfering with my private life. It was time-stamped March 15th, 2018, at 9:47 p.m. I had never written those words. I scrolled down. You're an adult. I don't need you questioning my decisions. April 3rd, 2018. If you can't respect my marriage, then we don't have anything left to talk about. April 29th, 2018. Your mother would be absolutely ashamed of how you're treating me if she could see you right now. May 17th, 2018. That last text hit me like a physical blow to the face. There was absolutely no way on earth I would ever say something like that. I would never use Clara's memory as a weapon. I could never say that to David. I kept scrolling down the screen. Stop calling me until you learn how to support me. June 8th, 2018. I've asked you for space repeatedly. This is turning into harassment. July 2nd, 2018. 17 text messages, each one colder and more distant than the last. Every single one had been sent from my phone. The timestamps were right there, all marked as delivered. My coffee had gone completely cold, and I couldn't even remember when I had picked up the mug. Between March and July, I received 17 texts exactly like that, David said, his voice level, each one colder than the last. David, I never wrote a single one of these. I never even saw them on my phone. I honestly thought you stopped calling because you were wrapped up in work. Elena told me, I know you didn't write them, Dad, David said. But for 4 straight months, I genuinely believed my own father wanted absolutely nothing to do with me. If you've ever been systematically isolated from someone you love, you know that the abuser never does it with a massive blowout. They do it slowly, like a frog in a pot of warming water. They make you believe that the distance was your own choice all along. After I got that last text in July, David continued, I just stopped trying to call. What was the point? You had made it incredibly clear that you didn't want to hear from me. Because I thought you were the one who stopped calling, I said. I sat by the phone waiting for you every single Sunday. Elena always told me you had texted her saying you were trapped at the office. I tried calling you 17 times. Every single time she took my phone and promised you'd call back. And then these messages went out. We just sat there staring at the phone screen resting between us on the table. How did she even do it? I asked. She probably just grabbed your phone when you weren't looking, David said. Or she synced your iMessage account to a web browser. It's incredibly easy to do if you have physical access to the device. I remembered when I got a new phone last year and Elena had offered to set it up for me, transferring all my contacts and data. I had actually thanked her for doing it. She separated us, I whispered, systematically. Yeah, David agreed. Before she could make a move on your assets, she had to dismantle your support system first. A son who might notice a financial discrepancy. A son who happens to work in financial fraud investigation on Wall Street. Weakness, son, handled. Handled, David repeated. Done. Cleared away. The vulnerability had been eliminated. We sat across from each other as the snow kept swirling outside the window. The November darkness had completely taken over Chicago. Neither of us said a word for several minutes. I thought about every single Sunday over those 4 months. Every Sunday I spent wondering why David wouldn't call me. Every birthday card I sent out that only received a cold, brief reply. That massive chasm between us that kept growing, while I could never figure out the reason why. David had been deliberately, systematically pushed away. It was as if he had been completely erased from my life, and I had actually believed he was just being distant. The silence stretching between us now felt heavy with all those lonely Sundays, heavy with the painful questions of why my own son had cut ties. I'm so sorry, I said. Why are you apologizing? David asked. Because I believed the lies. Because I didn't dig deeper to find out why you weren't calling. Dad, she faked messages from your own phone. She intercepted every single call I made. She used your voice, your number, and your authority, as my father, to build a wall between us. This isn't your fault, but it still feels like it is. I know. The snow kept falling. The cafe stayed warm, smelling of roasted coffee beans and damp wool coats. It felt safe, a temporary sanctuary, a shelter far away from the hidden microphones and the poisoned drinks. We sat in that booth for another 20 minutes without speaking. Outside, the snow kept patting against the glass. David's coffee was completely cold now. My hands were flat on the table, resting next to the phone displaying all those text messages I had never written. When we finally stood up to leave, David placed a hand on my shoulder, the very first time he had touched me like that in months. I realized right then that some damages can never be completely undone. You just have to acknowledge that the scar is there. I had to go back home and drink that poisoned cocktail, sitting right across from the woman who had stolen my son from me before she could steal everything else I had left. At 11:30 Friday night, I turned on Clara's old laptop. I did it because David had asked me earlier that afternoon if I had ever checked my late wife's old files, and because I suddenly felt this desperate need to know if Clara had seen the danger long before I was blinded by it. I had made it through Thursday night, getting back to the house at 9:45 p.m. Elena had brought me that nightly nightcap, the one I now knew was spiked with sedatives. We sat in the living room while she chatted about routine gallery business, and I pretended to drink it. It was another performance inside a performance. The second she went into the bathroom, I poured most of the liquid down the kitchen sink, leaving just a tiny bit at the bottom, so she would see an empty glass when she came back out. Friday had gone the exact same way. Normal routines, normal conversations. But the weight of knowing the truth pressed down on my chest like a boulder with every single word we spoke. Now it was 11:30 p.m. Elena was fast asleep upstairs, and I was sitting in the office, opening Clara's old MacBook after pulling it out from the very bottom drawer of my desk. It had been sitting there untouched for 5 years. I had sealed it away 3 months after her funeral back in 2015. I couldn't bring myself to look at it because it simply hurt too much. A thick layer of dust had settled over the case, and the power cord had gone stiff from sitting in the dark for so many years. I plugged it into the wall and lifted the screen. The startup chime sounded like a voice echoing from a past life. Her desktop wallpaper appeared. It was a photo of the three of us standing by Lake Michigan. David was only 14 at the time, standing right between us, and everyone was laughing. The date in the bottom right corner read, March 2013. 5 years and 8 months ago. I stared at that photograph. Clara looked completely healthy, captured right before the final, rapid decline, before the brain aneurysm stripped everything away from us. I had no idea what I was actually looking for. It was just that question David asked this afternoon that had planted an unignorable seed in my mind. Did you ever look through Mom's files, her emails, her documents? I had told him no at the time. It was just too painful. David had nodded understandingly, but the look on his face suggested that I really needed to check. So here I was. I opened her email application. The password had been saved locally on the machine for years. Her inbox loaded incredibly slowly. Messages that hadn't been touched in 5 years, most of them long since turned into junk mail. I clicked on the drafts folder. There was only a single unsent email sitting inside. It was dated March 14th, 2013. There was no recipient address listed, and the subject line simply read, "If something happens." I clicked it open. The text was brief, typed out in Clara's familiar clumsy hunt and peck style. "Richard, if you are reading this, it means I didn't have enough time to tell you face to face. That woman didn't just appear in our lives by accident. I've seen her twice now in the hospital parking lot. I don't know what she wants, but I am terrified. Before you make any major decisions, find someone you can trust completely and check everything out." I read those words over and over 3 separate times. That woman, the hospital parking lot. Twice. March 2013. It was a full year after that, in June 2014, when I officially met Elena at that charity art auction. My hands began to shake uncontrollably. Clara had spotted her. She saw someone watching us. saw the dangers circling our lives while she was facing her own end. She had tried to write down a warning, but she never sent it. She never got the chance. The dead are always trying to protect the living, usually in ways we only discover when we're pushed right to the edge. An unsent email, a locked drawer, a warning we simply weren't ready to hear until it was almost too late. I checked the dates again. March 14th, 2013. That draft was created exactly 3 weeks before Clara's very last hospital stay. Throughout early 2013, she was constantly slipping in and out of the hospital for brain surgeries and endless complications, getting weaker by the day, losing weight, and slowly giving up hope. And during one of those routine visits, she spotted a woman lingering in the parking lot. Twice. That woman didn't just appear in our lives by accident. I went ahead and dug up Clara's old medical records, the ones I had kept all these years. I found the exact dates for her March appointments, March 5th and March 12th. Both visits were over at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. That was the exact same hospital where Elena claimed she used to work as an art therapy program consultant. It was also where she claimed she had attended an art auction, the very one that supposedly brought us together. But she had already been there a full year before that, tracking Clara, watching me, just biding her time. I sat there in the pitch-black office, the cold glow of the laptop screen lighting up my face. Elena was fast asleep in the bedroom upstairs, while Clara's 5-year-old warning burned on the screen right in front of me. March 2013. Clara was slowly dying, staring out of a hospital window into a parking lot, watching a woman named Elena Hayes track us from a distance, already planning, already locking in her prey. Clara saw her, knew something was terribly wrong, and tried to write down a warning, but she ran out of time before she could finish it. She was admitted to the hospital on April 7th and passed away on April 23rd. I had closed this laptop back in July 2013 and never opened it again. 5 years and 4 months of absolute silence. 5 years and 4 months where Clara was actively trying to tell me the truth from the other side. And I had been so buried in my own grief that I was completely deaf to it. I mapped out the timeline. Clara passed away on April 23rd, 2013. I met Elena on June 12th, 2014, 14 months later. But Elena had been there the entire time. She watched from a hospital parking lot while my wife lay dying. Then she waited 14 months, waiting for my grief to settle into the kind of heavy, unbearable loneliness she could exploit. And then she showed up at a charity gala, wearing a beautiful gown, carrying a flawless story about a gallery and an art consulting job. And I believed every single word she said. 5 years. 5 whole years of silence that could have been a life-saving warning if I had just opened this computer in July 2013 instead of locking it away in a drawer. If I hadn't let the grief completely destroy me. If I had just been a little bit stronger. But I wasn't. I was totally broken. And that was exactly what she counted on. While Clara was taking her last breaths, Elena was right there watching and planning. I looked back at the desktop wallpaper. Lake Michigan, the 3 of us. Clara's arm wrapped around David and my hand resting on Clara's shoulder. The wind was messing up our hair, and we were all smiling straight at the camera. March 2013, the exact month that photo was taken. The exact month Clara saw someone watching us in the parking lot. The exact month she tried to write a warning she would never get to finish. 3 months before she died. 5 years before I finally discovered it. I sat there until 1 a.m. with Clara's email still open on the screen. Before she ever got sick, before Elena ever entered the picture, before everything fell apart, Clara had already seen the phantom that would destroy us, and she tried to warn me, but I had closed the laptop in my grief and never looked back. Upstairs, Elena was sleeping in the bed that used to belong to Clara. I slowly, incredibly carefully closed the laptop frame, almost as if Clara could still feel it. I finally understood that every single person who had ever truly loved me had been trying to save me, except for myself. We met up again at the temporary office at 8 o'clock Saturday morning. There were only 4 days left until the charity auction gala. The time for gathering evidence was completely over. Now it was time to start using it. I had spent all of Friday night staring at Clara's computer. Her warning about the woman in the hospital parking lot burned deep into my mind. On Saturday morning, I woke up at 6 o'clock, brewed some coffee, and told Elena I needed to go check on a foundational issue at a historic building renovation site. She believed it without a second thought. Why wouldn't she? For 4 years, I had been the perfect, absolutely trusting prey. I brought Clara's laptop and every single piece of evidence we had accumulated over the past 5 days to the hidden office. The USB files, Hector's security drive, Dr. Chen's toxicology report, and the screenshots of the fake text messages David had captured. David was already there. The desk was completely covered in legal pads, filled with his sharp, lawyer-style shorthand notes. Thomas booted up his computer, displaying his investigation files, bank statements, property titles, and the list of victims. The atmosphere in the room had completely shifted. There were no more questions about what was happening. Now it was entirely about how we were going to strike back. I set the evidence flat on the desk. 4 days left, I said. The charity auction on Wednesday night. That is our window. Thomas nodded. We have the proof. We have the witnesses. We have their exact timeline down. Now we just need a strategy. I pulled out a chair and sat across from him. Tell me how we take them down, I said. Not just Elena. All of them. Thomas closed his laptop and leaned forward over the table. The auction on Wednesday night gives you the ultimate home court advantage, he said. 400 attendees, the architecture elite, wealthy donors, prominent politicians. It's a national event, a massive public venue, and the media will be recording the entire thing. Elena chose this specific venue because she assumes that in front of all your professional peers, you'll be far too embarrassed to cause a scene. I don't give a damn about my reputation anymore, I replied. I know, and that is exactly why we are going to use it against her. But before we get there, we have to keep things steady. It's a 5-step plan. He pulled out a notepad, writing as he spoke. First, absolutely no confrontations until Wednesday. Keep everything completely normal at home. She cannot have any suspicion that you know anything. I nodded. Second, starting today, you need to act worse. Act significantly more forgetful, more exhausted, and more confused. Start misplacing things. Make Elena believe the sedatives are working even better than she anticipated. Feed her confidence. Let her think the victory is right around the corner. David looked over at me. Dad, you have to play the part of an aging man losing his grip. I get it, I said. Thomas kept going. Third, we prepare a bait document. Something that looks exactly like an asset transfer or a legal trust restructuring. You're going to sign it using a special forensic ink that David brought with him. This ink tracks every single scan, copy, and digital transmission. The exact second she forwards those documents to Marcus Thorne's network, we'll have ironclad proof of interstate wire fraud. Fourth, we force them to bring their entire network into the open. We don't stop at Elena. We want Marcus Thorne in that room. If possible, we get Dr. Aris there too. We want every single person involved in this conspiracy either sitting in that ballroom or legally tied to whatever happens that night. And fifth? I stared straight into Thomas's eyes. Fifth, Thomas said, meeting my gaze. You expose them right on that stage. Completely public, fully recorded, right in front of 400 prominent figures. She won't be able to run, she won't be able to deny it, and she won't be able to slip a legal petition through to turn you into a silent ward or orchestrate a sudden accident. The ultimate irony, Richard, is that she built that stage herself. We are going to use her own platform as the gallows to execute her plans. When you stop being the hunted prey and turn into the hunter, you don't feel a massive rush of power. It just feels like a cold decision to use the only weapon you have left, exploiting their own arrogance. How public is this going to be? I asked. David checked over his notes. You're scheduled to give the opening remarks. You have a 10-minute slot to thank the donors and sponsors. Elena arranged that months ago, probably expecting you to stumble and lose your train of thought on stage. completely locking in her public narrative about your cognitive decline. So I'm going to use those 10 minutes to display the evidence in front of 400 people, I said. In front of 400 witnesses, Thomas corrected me. There's a massive difference. I thought about that word. Witnesses, not just onlookers. People who could be called to a courtroom. People who could never pretend they didn't see or hear what happened. What about the police? I asked. I've already coordinated with the FBI's white-collar crime division, Thomas said. They will be in the room, but they're going to look like standard event security. The second you finish your presentation, they move in to make the arrests. But Richard, for this whole plan to work, you have to hold it together for the next 5 days. 5 days of acting significantly worse than you actually feel. 5 days of drinking those poison cocktails and pretending they're working. 5 days of sleeping right next to a person who is actively trying to erase you. David's face was incredibly tight. Dad, can you actually handle this? Can you play the part for 5 days? Act like a confused, exhausted old man? Drink that glass every night and pretend you're fading away? I thought back to the past 4 years, to the sheer vulnerability of living alongside a woman who was actively wearing 3 completely different skins. For 4 months, I had been systematically poisoned right across my own dining table. For 5 years, paralyzed by my own grief, I had left Clara's computer sitting in a drawer. I locked eyes with David. I've already been acting for 4 years without even knowing it, I said. 5 days is nothing. The room went dead silent for a moment. Thomas jotted down a quick note on his pad. Perfect. Starting today, you need to appear significantly more forgetful. Misplace your car keys. Forget what day of the week it is. Ask her the exact same question twice. Focus on those tiny details that will validate the narrative she desperately wants to believe. I can do that, I replied. One more thing, Thomas added. Between now and Wednesday, she is absolutely going to hand you some documents to sign. Trust amendments, corporate restructuring paperwork, medical powers of attorney. Sign them, but sign them using the special ink pen David brought. Every single signature you leave behind will turn into a digital beacon for a courtroom. David slid a pen across the desk toward me. It looked exactly like a standard Mont Blanc ballpoint. Forensic tracking ink, he explained. It illuminates under UV light and contains microscopic tags that prove exactly when and where a document was signed. I picked up the pen. It felt no different in my hand than any other ordinary pen. Before we wrap up, I said, unable to hold back the question that had been weighing on my chest for days. Thomas, I have to know. Is Robert involved in this? Thomas paused. That single hesitation told me everything I needed to know before he even opened his mouth. That was actually the very next question I was going to ask you, Richard, he said softly. Thomas didn't answer me directly about Robert, choosing instead to say it was the next priority in his investigation. That meant he was already digging, and whatever he was pulling up was incredibly ugly. David's face completely froze. He had known Robert his entire life, grew up calling him Uncle Robert. He remembered Clara's funeral, how Robert had literally held me up when I could barely stand on my own 2 feet. If Robert had betrayed me, it would be the deepest scar of all. Thomas flipped open his laptop, his fingers flying across the keys with the practiced speed of an investigator who knew exactly where to look for answers. Let me show you what I just pulled up. At 2:47 p.m., a sharp chime echoed from Thomas's computer. Before he even finished reading the text on his screen, all the color drained from his face. What is it? David asked, leaning forward over the desk. Thomas turned the screen around to face us. The header of the encrypted report read, Subject, Robert Ashley, Financial Vulnerabilities, Timeline. I stared at Robert's name. Robert, a friend I had known for 20 years, the man who stood right by my side as a brother during Clara's funeral, the old friend who had introduced me to Elena with a bright, proud smile, acting as if he were handing me the greatest gift in the world. My hands went completely cold. September 2013, Thomas read aloud. Robert suffered a massive commercial real estate failure in the Loop, racking up $4.2 million in debt. Between late 2013 and early 2014, that debt snowballed significantly due to defaults and high-interest hard money lenders, a classic liquidation trap. The numbers on the screen began to blur before my eyes. 2014 was the exact year Robert introduced me to Elena. The debt structure was completely predatory, Thomas continued. By May 2014, with principal and interest combined, he owed $5.5 million. The lenders were preparing to forcefully liquidate his primary business assets. David's voice dropped to a whisper. How was that debt settled? May 15th, 2014. A single wire transfer for $5.5 million completely cleared his record in a single afternoon. The remitter, Olympus Art Valuation Trusts, a Delaware-registered LLC. Thomas pulled up another file on the screen. It's a shell company buried beneath 15 layers of corporate mapping, but I traced the ultimate funding source. The money came directly from an offshore account, controlled entirely by Marcus Thorne. I felt the entire room start to tilt. Robert sold me out. It's worse than just selling you out, Thomas said. The transaction logs show a systematic data transfer starting back in January 2014. Robert was feeding Marcus Thorne's network your medical appointment schedules, your asset valuations, your family vulnerabilities, and your daily routines. For 4 straight years, Richard, your best friend has been their inside informant. David skimmed through the documents rapidly. Wait. Robert introduced Elena to my dad in June 2014, exactly 1 month after his entire multi-million-dollar debt magically vanished. Exactly, Thomas said, highlighting the specific log entry. That introduction wasn't a friendly setup. It was a formal interview. Robert brought Elena to that charity auction because Marcus needed someone who could get close to Richard. That introduction was the exact currency Robert used to clear his debt. How exactly do you measure a 20-year friendship? Do you count it in the weekends spent talking for hours on the golf course? Do you measure it in those late-night phone calls when Clara was dying, where he would just sit on the line and listen to me breathe? Do you measure it in the thousands of tiny, insignificant moments that made me believe that beneath all the business transactions, there was someone who genuinely cared about my life? You can't place a dollar amount on betrayal, but clearly Robert found his exact price tag, $5.5 million. I stood up and walked over to the window. Outside, it was a routine Saturday afternoon, with Chicago traffic humming along and people moving with that absolute sense of ordinary life. People were just living their days, trusting their friends, believing that the world operated on some basic sense of logic. There's more, Thomas said quietly from behind me. I didn't turn around. Of course there is. The reports Robert was feeding them weren't passive. He was actively logging your grief patterns after Clara passed away. He noted exactly when you seemed confused or when you forgot a conversation. He is the one who helped them establish the foundation for your cognitive decline narrative by feeding them regular observations about your mental state. I thought back to a lunch we had at the golf club 4 months ago. Robert had dropped a very careful, concerned question. Richard, you look completely exhausted lately. Are you sleeping okay? I noticed you mentioned the exact same blueprint detail to me twice last week. I thought he was looking out for me, but in reality he was taking notes, gathering evidence, and actively helping them build the very gallows meant to destroy me. The night he introduced us, I said, my own voice sounding entirely foreign to me, Robert pulled me aside right before I met Elena. He said, I found someone incredibly special for you. Just trust me on this. And I did, because that's exactly what best friends do. He opened his mouth, keeping his eyes averted from mine. When I saw him at the club last, he asked about your memory, and his eyes kept darting away. I honestly thought he just couldn't bear to watch you age, Dad, but he couldn't bear to look at the man he had sold out who still trusted him completely. Thomas cleared his throat. There's one last piece. The forensic accounting team flagged this about an hour ago. I turned around. What? The exact offshore account that cleared Robert's debt is the same account that purchased Elena's engagement ring, an $87,000 charge at Cartier in July 2014. Thomas looked me dead in the eye. Marcus Thorne didn't just buy Robert's cooperation, he bought Elena's performance. The Cartier ring was purchased 3 weeks after Robert's debt was cleared. It was a package deal from day one. I didn't cry, and I didn't fly into a rage. I just felt a part of myself completely calcify, turning from flesh into cold, unfeeling stone. Every single memory I had was being forcefully redrawn. Every single moment of trust was being exposed as a carefully staged production. Robert's best man speech at my wedding, Elena's tears when I proposed to her. They were all acting, and they were all on the payroll. The auction gala is on Wednesday, I said, my voice sounding terrifyingly calm, as if it were drifting in from an immense distance. Is Robert going to be there? He's right on the attendee list, David confirmed. He RSVP'd to hear your opening remarks. Good. I walked back over to the table. Add him to the master list of witnesses. When we expose this whole thing, I want him sitting right in that room. I want him to watch the entire architecture collapse with his own eyes. Thomas nodded slowly. Richard, there's one more thing we need to discuss. There's a person who might be able to help us map out the entire early timeline. He pulled a crisp envelope out of his briefcase. This was mailed directly to my office yesterday. The sender is Anna Lee. She worked at the exact same hospital as Clara for 15 years. She claims she carries information regarding a warning Clara tried to leave you before she died. A warning about the very people you trusted. I took the envelope from his hand. The postmark was dated November 8th. I could faintly see the edges of handwritten paper inside. She wants to meet tomorrow morning, Thomas said. She told me she made a promise to Clara that she would wait until the day you were actually ready to hear the truth. She believes you're ready now. I stared at the name of my late wife's former colleague. Another fragment of the past reaching forward into the present. Another truth waiting to shatter the reality I had lived in. Tomorrow, I agreed. Let's find out exactly what Clara was trying to tell me. Thomas and I both agreed that it was far too dangerous for me to meet with Anna directly. If they were monitoring me as closely as Robert's log suggested, any unexpected contact would immediately trigger an alarm. David went in my place, driving out alone to the quiet cafe in Oak Park, where Anna had requested the meeting. The second the woman walked toward the booth, before she even sat down, David could tell she was completely terrified. Her eyes scanned the entire room twice in a matter of seconds, and her hands shook as she set her purse down on the table. She was wearing her nursing scrubs under a heavy trench coat with her hospital ID badge flipped backward against her chest to hide her name. Anna Lee? David kept his voice low. She nodded quickly. You're David. Thank you for coming to meet me. I couldn't reach out to your father directly. They monitor every single appointment, every phone call, and every single visitor he has. If I contacted him, they would know immediately. Anna Lee, 53 years old, a registered nurse who had worked alongside Clara for years, sat across from David looking like someone who had been running from a shadow for a very long time. Who exactly is doing the monitoring? David asked. Elena handles the daily reports, and Robert does the weekly summaries. But there's an entire rotation of people your father wouldn't even notice. Delivery drivers, the gardener. It's a complete surveillance web. How do you know all of this? Because I'm a part of it. Anna's voice cracked, turning into a muffled sob. I'm required to report on your father's physical health twice a month. His cognitive state, his physical decline, his medication intake, every single detail. Why? My brother made a massive mistake 15 years ago. Marcus Thorne holds the sealed evidence over our heads. If I don't report on your father's health, my brother goes straight to federal prison. Leverage. That is how they control every single person in their orbit. They find the exact vulnerability and squeeze. How long has this been going on? David asked. Since 2016. Right after your mother passed away and Elena moved into the house permanently. Anna looked straight at David. Clara knew something was wrong with Elena before she died. She begged me to keep an eye on your father for her, but by then I was already trapped. The ambient noise of the cafe seemed to fade into absolute silence. There's something else. Anna pulled out her phone, displaying a photograph of an elderly man standing by a lake, carrying a gentle, weathered expression. My father, Richard Lee. He died penniless and completely alone in a Wisconsin Veterans Care facility back in 2007. He lost absolutely everything. His life savings, his home, his dignity. He spent the last years of his life believing he was a complete failure who had ruined his family. David studied the photograph. What happened to him? Elena happened. He was her third target. She married him in 2004 and divorced him in 2006. By the time she walked away, he was entirely liquidated. He went to his grave believing he was just a foolish old man who made terrible investments. You knew exactly who she was this whole time. I knew what she did to my father. So when Marcus showed up in 2016 with my brother's file and offered me a job, I knew exactly what kind of monster I was helping. Anna's eyes welled with tears. I became the accomplice to the exact setup that killed my own father. I felt like I had no choice, but I still became that person. Some secrets are kept to protect the people you love. Others are kept because admitting them out loud means acknowledging your own absolute failure. I sent a letter once, Anna said, back in 2008, mailed straight to your father's architecture firm. It was an anonymous, handwritten letter warning him about Elena, laying out her entire criminal pattern, begging him to investigate. I never found out if he actually received it. David felt the floor beneath the booth tilt. He reached inside his briefcase and pulled out a heavily weathered envelope, a piece of paper he had carried with him for 10 full years. The front was addressed to Richard Vance, postmarked October 2008. It was the exact letter David had intercepted and opened himself when he was 18, driven by anger and suspicion that his father was moving on with a woman barely older than himself. He slid the envelope across the table. Anna stared down at her own handwriting. You have it. I was 18 years old. I tore it open first. I read all the warnings about Elena's past patterns, read that exact plea to investigate before it was too late. David said, his voice sounding entirely distant. But I never told him. I lied to myself, thinking it was just some jealous ex trying to ruin his happiness. I personally threw away the one chance to protect him. Sometimes the seeds of your own destruction are planted by the very people trying to protect you, simply out of youth and ignorance. Anna placed her hand firmly over David's. You were only 18. I was the adult who should have done more. We both failed him, David, but we can still help him right now. She pulled a black USB flash drive from her trench coat pocket and placed it right between them on the table. This is the complete list of victims. 10 names. 2 are marked as deceased, and 1 was logged as a suicide back in 2015. His name was James Howard. David picked up the drive. Who was he? The 6th victim. A 73-year-old widower with a net worth of $18 million. Elena married him in 2014, and by 2015 he was gone. The police ruled it a tragic firearm cleaning accident, and a will modification transferred everything directly to her. The case was closed. How many people does it take to build a fraud empire? 10 victims, 3 coerced accomplices, and 1 mastermind. And how many people does it take to tear it all down? Why are you telling me this? David asked. Because James Howard isn't dead. That suicide was entirely staged. He's been hiding out for 3 years, and he carries the original evidence that points directly to Marcus Thorne. The original wire transfers, the money trails, everything. If you can find him and convince him to take the stand, you can pull this entire network out by its roots. David watched as Anna scribbled a 10-digit phone number onto a napkin, showing a 715 area code for Wisconsin. He calls me once a year, Anna whispered, just to check if I'm still alive, if I'm still trapped. You call that number and he will answer. But James has been running for 3 years because he knows exactly what Marcus does to anyone who threatens him. Convincing him to show his face won't be easy. David stared at the number on the napkin, a dead man's phone number, a lifeline from a ghost, and our absolute last shot at turning a victim into a witness. David dialed that Wisconsin number later that same night. James Howard picked up on the 3rd ring, his voice completely flat. Who gave you this number? When David spoke Anna Lee's name, the line went dead silent for a full 30 seconds. Then the voice spoke. Green Bay, Highway 87, the Hole-in-the-Wall Diner, Tuesday afternoon at 2 o'clock. Come alone. The man sitting in the furthest corner booth of that small Wisconsin diner looked absolutely nothing like the photographs from 2015. He had lost a full 20 pounds, His hair was completely gone, and his gray eyes never once left the entrance door. David slid into the seat right across from him. James kept his hands entirely hidden beneath the table. James Howard. That name has been dead for 3 years, he said, his voice rough and gravelly, like someone who hadn't spoken in ages. You showing up here means I might have to die all over again. I came alone. James gestured with his chin toward the parking lot outside. I've been watching that lot for an hour. I've logged every single car, every license plate, and every single face that walked through that door. You're driving a rental Chevy with Illinois plates. Probably picked it up at O'Hare this morning. That means someone knows you're here. My investigators set up this meeting. Thomas Reynolds. James's jaw tightened. Thomas Reynolds is sharp. It took him 3 years to find me. That terrifies me because if he can find me, they can too. The waitress brought over their coffee, black for both of them. The second she walked away, David leaned in. Anna told me you have the evidence, he whispered. James Howard was 66 years old, frail and wearing a heavily faded flannel jacket. This was a man who once owned a multi-million-dollar tech firm in Silicon Valley, who once lived in a luxury estate overlooking the San Francisco Bay, and who used to carry a respected name. Now he was working under an alias in a state where nobody cared to look. Evidence of what? He asked. Elena, Marcus Thorne, and the entire 15-year fraud operation. You were the 6th name on that list, David said. My father is the 8th. You know exactly what happens to men like them in the end. I know exactly what they want to happen. I'm trying to stop it, David said. James studied him carefully. How much has your father lost? Nothing physical yet, but they've already set the stage to take everything. Over $30 million in assets, absolute medical conservatorship, powers of attorney. Every single piece of legal paperwork has already been drawn up. Smart. They're getting tighter with their methods. James finally brought his hands out from beneath the table, holding nothing. When they targeted me, things were still pretty messy. Married in 2014, divorced by 2015. By the time the assets split and the estate liquidation wrapped up, I had absolutely nothing left. She took the company, the bank accounts, the properties. $18 million, entirely gone. I'm sorry. Don't be. James's eyes went cold. I'm no innocent bystander in this. The steam from the coffee rose steadily between them. 2009, James whispered. Seattle. A man named Gregory Reeves, a 68-year-old widower with a massive portfolio of commercial real estate. Elena and I ran the play together. She handled the romance. I posed as her business associate, validating the legitimacy of her investment opportunities. We took him for $400,000. David felt his chest tighten up. Ni bang lata? I helped her. There was no shame in James's voice, just a flat statement of fact. We split the cash and went our separate ways. I thought we were partners. 3 years later, she showed up at my office with a flawless smile and a business proposal. By the time I realized what was happening, she had embedded herself like a virus into my firm, my finances, and my entire life. The victims and the accomplices aren't always opposing forces. Sometimes they are the exact same person, separated only by time and the order of whose turn it is to bleed. Then why did you fake your own death? David asked. Because Marcus Thorne doesn't like leaving loose ends. I had the evidence. Transaction receipts, email threads, recordings. I was foolish enough to try and use them to threaten him. 2 weeks later, my brakes completely failed while I was driving down I-94. I survived the crash, and the mechanic found out the brake lines had been deliberately cut clean through. That was the exact second I realized I could either fight and get killed or vanish and stay alive. So you chose to vanish. I vanished with a plan. I staged a fatal accident at sea, left behind a trail of tragic evidence, and made sure absolutely nobody would suspect a thing. My brother handled the memorial service and laid my memory to rest. As far as the world is concerned, I've been dead ever since. He leaned in closer across the table. So tell me, what exactly do you want from me? The evidence from the first victim back in 2004, the Chicago businessman. Anna mentioned you carry the original files. Why him? Because that is the starting point. The first victim establishes a permanent pattern. It proves this isn't an accident or coincidence. It proves it's a system. James reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. For a split second, David's entire body tensed up, but the man simply pulled out a tiny metal flash drive and set it down on the table between them. "I kept everything," James said. "Every single victim I discovered, every transaction I witnessed or took part in, and every piece of proof I could gather. Because I knew that a day would come when I'd need to use it to buy my own life." "I need the file on that first case," David said. James slid the drive forward. "The wire transfers, the forged paperwork, the email exchanges between Elena and Marcus mapping out the initial approach. It's all on there. But I have one condition. Name it. I stay dead. You don't put me on a witness stand, you don't write my name into court documents, and you don't tell a soul where I am. You just bring these files into the light. Let the evidence do the talking." "Deal." James stood up, throwing down enough cash to cover the coffee onto the table. "Good luck, kid. Your father's going to need it. Marcus Thorne has been running this play for 20 years. He's never lost, and he's never run into a prey who actually knows he's being hunted." James let out a cold, sharp chuckle. "No, he definitely hasn't." David caught a flight back to Chicago that same night. By the time I pushed the front door open at 8:45 p.m., Elena was sitting in the living room with an Hermes leather binder resting open in front of her. "Perfect timing," she said brightly. "I have the legal documents ready for the trust restructuring. Just needs your signature. 47 pages. Trust amendments, tax protection clauses, and asset redistribution terms." The legal jargon was incredibly dense, professional, and completely seamless. David had given me a special forensic ink pen. Under normal light, it looked completely identical to standard ink, but it was impossible to hide under forensic chemical analysis. Every single scan or copy would carry a unique, microscopic signature. I signed my name everywhere Elena pointed. Right here, and right here. Initial the amendments on these pages too. My hand was shaking slightly. It wasn't part of the act. It was because I knew every single word I signed was the bait. Every initial was handing them a golden ticket to their own perceived victory. All set. Elena packed up the documents, her tight composure completely relaxing for the first time in days. "All done. This is everything you asked for. Everything is settled now. You're fully protected." She smiled, gently dynamic, tracing her hand over mine. "I'll file these with the attorneys tomorrow morning. Get all the records logged before the auction gala on Wednesday." She kissed my forehead and headed upstairs. I heard the bedroom door shut, followed by the muffled sound of her lowering her voice to make a phone call. I walked over to the wiretap receiver David had hidden inside the bookshelf. He pressed play for me. Elena's voice came through the speaker crystal clear. "It's done. See you at the gala on Wednesday." Marcus Thorne's smooth, confident response followed. "Perfect. I'll be there right on time." The trap was fully set. The bait was in the water. The predators were circling. Wednesday would decide exactly who was the prey. I stood by the office window, staring out at the frozen Chicago night. In 48 hours, the annual Historical Preservation Auction Gala would begin, drawing the eyes of the entire city. 400 witnesses, a single stage, and absolutely no turning back. Those 48 hours were compressed into a sequence of highly controlled performances, acting completely confused during dinners, clumsily knocking over medication bottles right under Elena's watchful eye, and sleeping in separate rooms, just as we had for the past few months. By 6:30 Wednesday morning, I had stepped entirely into the role. Elena was helping me tie my necktie. Her hands moved rapidly over the deep blue silk, her gestures just as gentle, practiced, and intimate as they had been for the last 4 years. I knew for a fact this would be the absolute last time. She stood there in the kitchen, completely focused on straightening the knot. The morning light caught the gold bracelet resting on her wrist, the one I had given her for our second anniversary, back when I was still a fool who believed in love. "Today is incredibly important, Richard." Her voice was soft, carrying a wave of encouragement. "All you need to do is stand up there and show a confident smile. Leave the rest to me." "I trust you," I said softly, letting my gaze wander aimlessly, I've always trusted you." She smiled and kissed my cheek, and that warmth felt incredibly real. I could feel her hand linger on my shoulder, her thumb gently rubbing against the fabric of my suit jacket. She could afford to spend her kindness on me this morning, because she was entirely convinced that I was walking straight into my own destruction. By tonight, she believed I would be legally incapacitated on paper, stripped of all my authority and left entirely at her mercy. She could easily afford to be generous to a man who was already completely defeated. "You're going to do amazing out there," she said. "If you ever lose your place, just remember to slow down your speech. Take your time. Everyone in that room will understand. What if I completely forget what I'm supposed to say? Then I'll be right there in the front row. Just look at me. I'll help you get through it." I nodded, playing the part of the incredibly grateful, slow husband one final time. By 8:15 a.m., we arrived at the grand ballroom of the Intercontinental Hotel in downtown Chicago. My phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a quick text from David. "Attorney Desmond signed the asset freeze. Thomas and the FBI team are completely in position. Walk straight up to the stage." I deleted the text and slid the phone back into my pocket. Elena looped her arm through mine as we stepped into the grand hall. 400 seats were arranged in a massive curve, flanked on both sides by giant LED projection screens. Towering crystal chandeliers bathed the entire space in a warm golden glow. This was the venue for the annual Historical Preservation and Art Auction Gala, and Vance Architectural Preservation was stepping up as the primary sponsor for the opening remarks. This stage was exactly where everything was going to end. "The ballroom looks absolutely beautiful," Elena said, her voice dripping with encouragement. "You're going to completely shine up there." The attendees were already starting to take their seats. Architecture executives, wealthy collectors, and representatives from the mayor's office. 400 witnesses. I scanned the entire room, counting the players in my head. Elena was sitting right next to me in the front row, wearing her black haute couture gown, keeping her hand resting gently on my arm, playing the part of the supportive wife to absolute perfection. Marcus Thorne sat in the third row, dressed in a sharp navy blue suit, styled flawlessly. He didn't even bother to look in my direction, carrying himself with an absolute, towering confidence. Robert was sitting near the side exit doors. He looked completely restless, shifting in his seat like a man looking for an immediate escape route. The 20-year friend who sold me out for $5.5 million. Dr. Aris was sitting toward the back row, the physician who falsified my medical evaluations in exchange for a phony research fund sponsorship. Elena's attorney, the man responsible for drafting the conservatorship paperwork, sat right along the aisle, ready to witness the legal trap snap shut. "How many people does it take to destroy a man?" I counted them up. 9. "And how many witnesses does it take to rebuild him?" 400. Thomas had to be tucked away in a corner somewhere. He had explicitly warned me not to look for him or make any eye contact. David was lurking near the back doors with the legal team. Forensic accountants, court liaisons, and undercover FBI agents were all completely in position. Everyone was in the room. The conspirators who believed they were about to witness my final public humiliation, the prominent figures who were about to watch the truth unfold, and the federal agents who were about to make the arrests. Not a single person who betrayed me realized that the people with absolutely no way out were them. At 8:45 a.m., the master of ceremonies walked up to the podium and tapped the microphone. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are incredibly honored to welcome a true pioneer in the field of historical preservation and cultural legacy. For over 25 years, Vance Preservation has protected countless historical landmarks across Chicago. Please join me in welcoming the founder and chief executive officer of the firm, Mr. Richard Vance." The applause echoed loudly throughout the ballroom, polite and professional. Those 400 people clapping had absolutely no idea what was coming next. Elena gave my hand a tight, firm squeeze, leaning in close to whisper, "You've got this." She looked at me with a face full of flawless pride and support. 4 years of practice had turned her performance into an absolute masterpiece. Marriage is the ultimate long con. You spend 4 years playing a character so intensely that you completely forget which parts of yourself are actually real. I stood up, letting her hand slide away from my palm. Amid the continuous applause, I walked toward the stage. Every single step was calculated. My shoulders were slightly slouched, my pace purposely hesitant. It was the physical manifestation of an aging man losing his grip. I had practiced this walk for 8 straight days, making sure every single detail was perfect. The slight hesitation as I stepped onto the platform, the way my hands gripped the edges of the podium for support, the faint look of confusion on my face as I adjusted the microphone. 400 faces stared back at me. Elena's smile in the front row never wavered for a second. She looked entirely poised and calm. Marcus Thorne checked his phone, already looking incredibly bored with the event. Robert shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but he didn't move. I gripped the podium tightly, forcing my hands to shake slightly, mimicking a loss of physical control. The ballroom fell completely silent. The massive LED screens behind me lit up, preparing to display the standard sponsor presentation. I looked out at the audience, letting my gaze drift aimlessly over their faces, allowing everyone to see a vulnerable old man struggling to remember why he was standing on that stage. Elena gave me an encouraging nod from the front row. I cleared my throat, leaned into the microphone, and began my remarks. My voice sounded exactly as I had rehearsed it, carrying a slight tremor, the distinct hesitation of an old man who had completely lost his train of thought. The microphone amplified the sound across the ears of all 400 people, everyone waiting to see how the moment would unfold. Do you know exactly when a performance ends and when the truth actually begins? I gripped the podium firmly, flattening my palms against the polished wood surface. The tremor in my hands was entirely real now, not from confusion, but from a massive surge of adrenaline. I knew for a fact that from this exact second forward, every single word out of my mouth would either buy my freedom or cement my destruction. I scanned the audience. Front row. Elena sat perfectly upright in her black gown, watching me with the standard gaze of a proud wife. But her eyes weren't fixed on my face. She was staring directly at the leather binder, resting right next to the microphone, the one she had explicitly placed there before we left the house this morning. Inside were the 47 pages of the trust restructuring, the asset transfer authorizations, and the voluntary medical conservatorship agreements. She expected me to open it right now, to clumsily flip through the paperwork in front of 400 witnesses, and to sign everything away in a public display of vulnerability. An aging man, supported by his loving wife, making the responsible decision to protect his assets from his own cognitive decline. Third row. Marcus Thorne was checking his watch, carrying the posture of an important businessman who had somewhere else to be, entirely convinced this whole thing would wrap up in a matter of minutes. Over to the left, near the sound booth, David caught my eye and gave me a firm nod. Everything was set. I took a deep breath and leaned into the microphone. "Thank you all for being here today," I said, my voice still carrying a faint tremor. "I know you all came out this morning to hear a speech regarding historical landmarks, cultural preservation, and urban renewal." The audience listened politely, with a few people offering sympathetic smiles, having heard the rumors about my failing health. But I don't want to talk about blueprints or historic buildings today. I want to tell you a story instead. A story about an antique grandfather clock and a secret compartment built right into a wall. Elena's posture completely shifted. It was an incredibly tiny movement, but I caught it instantly. Her spine went completely rigid, marking the very first crack in her mask of calm confidence. Marcus Thorne stopped looking at his watch. The entire ballroom grew noticeably tight. My late wife Clara absolutely loved that grandfather clock, I continued, my voice gaining strength. She placed it in the corner of my home office 20 years ago. I never moved it, and I never questioned it, and I never once knew what was hiding right behind it. 400 people listened in absolute silence. A few days ago, I decided to repaint the room. I moved the clock away from the wall and discovered the paneling behind it had been deliberately cut out. A hidden compartment, a space I never knew existed, had been carved deep into the drywall, staying hidden for years. I paused for a second, letting the detail land with the audience. Someone had recently opened that compartment, someone who knew exactly where to look. Elena moved her hands to her lap, locking her fingers tightly together, a classic defensive posture meant to mask a sudden rush of panic. I looked inside the space, I said, and I found something that wasn't supposed to be uncovered yet, at least not before today. Every story has two types of listeners, the ones who have no idea how it ends, and the ones who know exactly what's coming. The ordinary attendees in the audience still hadn't figured it out. They assumed this was just the rambling of a confused old man who was losing his sanity, choosing to talk about clocks and walls instead of architecture. But Elena understood completely. Marcus understood. They knew exactly what I was describing, and more importantly, they knew I wasn't supposed to have found it 4 days early. The compartment itself was completely empty, I continued, the tremor entirely vanishing from my voice as it grew loud and clear. But the dust inside left a perfect outline, the shape of a small rectangular object that had been resting there for a very long time, and had only recently been taken out. I reached my hand directly into the inner pocket of my suit jacket. Elena's eyes locked onto my movement, tracing my hand with absolute intensity. She let out a sharp, sudden gasp. In the dead silence of the ballroom, that tiny sound echoed clearly. It meant she had finally realized exactly what was about to happen. "The security setup at my house is incredibly thorough," I said. "Most people completely overlook the lens mounted at the end of the second-floor hallway, but the angle happens to look directly at that specific wall panel." My fingers closed around the cold rectangular drive inside my pocket. I pulled the logs and reviewed the footage. I saw exactly who moved that grandfather clock. I saw who opened that hidden space. I saw exactly what they took out, and I tracked exactly where they went with it. All the color drained from Marcus Thorne's face. It wasn't full panic yet, not quite. It was the absolute shock of a man realizing a flawless, multi-million-dollar plan had just suffered a catastrophic failure. "And then I did something incredibly interesting," I said. "I followed the digital trail and I retrieved the object that had been taken." I pulled the black, encrypted hard drive straight out of my pocket and held it high above the podium. The stage lights caught the matte black finish and the metal fingerprint sensor, drawing the eyes of all 400 people directly to the tiny device in my hand. You can't rehearse a moment like this. You just have to push forward into the dark and trust that the truth cuts deeper than any blade. "This device," I said softly, setting it flat onto the white surface of the podium for everyone to see, "is the exact object that sat hidden behind Clara's grandfather clock for 4 straight years. It doesn't belong to me. I didn't put it there. But I am entirely certain there are people sitting in this exact room who know exactly what is stored inside it." Absolute, dead silence blanketed the ballroom. There was no rustling of papers, no shifting of chairs, no coughing, and no whispering. 400 people completely held their breath. The black hard drive sat quietly under the bright glare of the LED stage lights. It was tiny, but it was undeniable. Physical evidence, public proof, the kind of concrete data that couldn't be argued away, explained away, or dismissed as the delusions of an old man losing his mind. Elena gripped the armrests of her chair so tightly her knuckles turned paper white. Marcus Thorne reached his hand slowly toward his jacket pocket, going for his phone. Over by the side exit, Robert looked like a prisoner who had just realized every single escape hatch had been welded shut. Dr. Aris froze completely in the back row. Elena's attorney began typing rapidly on his screen, likely messaging his law partners to assess the sudden exposure and impending liability. Inside this drive, I discovered 4 months of continuous surveillance footage. My voice was completely level now, carrying absolutely no hesitation. Travel itineraries, financial transactions, fabricated medical evaluations, detailed asset liquidation plans. Every single piece of my life had been meticulously mapped out, categorized, and filed away, just waiting for the perfect date on the calendar to be executed. I looked directly down into the front row, locking eyes with Elena. The only problem is I found the files 4 days early, and that gave me more than enough time to understand exactly what I was looking at. It gave me the time to verify the records, and it gave me the time to find out exactly who manufactured these files and what they were trying to accomplish. The mask of the devoted, supportive wife completely shattered across Elena's face. In its place was a sharp, predatory calculation. She was mapping out the angles, looking for a way to run. Marcus Thorne had his phone out now, his thumbs flying across the screen in a desperate attempt to salvage the situation. I let the silence stretch across the ballroom. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. Long enough to watch Marcus's fingers completely freeze over his screen as his network access went dead. Long enough for Elena to realize that whatever was coming next, she had absolutely no power to stop it. I broke the silence. I picked up the connection cable that had already been routed to the podium and plugged it straight into the black hard drive. The twin LED projection screens flanking the stage flashed stark white, then dropped into absolute darkness, before violently lighting up with a fresh display. The first high-resolution document filled the screens, displaying 4 separate passport photos side by side. It was the exact same woman, the exact same eyes, the exact same facial structure, down to the tiny scar over the left eyebrow. And right beneath the photos, the screens displayed 4 completely different names: Elena Hayes, Sophie Levine, Emma Wilson, and Carmen Lopez. If all of these are the exact same person, I said into the microphone, my voice cutting through the room like ice, then what we are looking at are 4 different identities, used across 4 different cities, to live 4 completely separate lives. An audible collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. I watched the physical shockwave wash over the crowd as people finally connected the dots. It was the sudden, heavy realization that something incredibly sinister was being dragged into the open, right in front of them. Elena sat completely frozen in the very front row. She didn't look back at the twin screens. She kept her eyes locked, dead on me. The display flashed to a new slide. This time it was a mountain of financial files. Bank statements, transaction histories, and wire transfers. The header at the top of the screen read, Private Bank of Boston. Account ending in 817. Current balance, $3,847,629.43. Victims, I said plainly, spanning a full 15 years. There's nearly $4 million sitting in this single account alone, and there are 4 other accounts, held at different banks across different states, following the exact same pattern. The slide changed again, revealing a list of 10 typed names. Richard Lee, 2004, the very first target. George Harrison, 2004. Paul Stern, 2006. James Howard, 2014. 9 men in total. My name was scheduled to become the 10th on this list, or rather, as the documentation puts it, target number 8. The screen shifted once more, but this time it was a video file. The timestamp in the corner read November 6th, 2018, at 2:17 a.m. It was the interior of my home office, captured perfectly by the pinhole camera hidden inside the crystal chandelier. The footage showed Elena sitting right at my mahogany desk, opening her laptop and using her phone flashlight to systematically scan my files. The resolution was crisp enough to see exactly what she was capturing: equity transfer forms, trust modification paperwork, and tax declarations. "That is my office," I said, my voice echoing through the hall. 2:00 in the morning, exactly 8 days ago, while I was fast asleep upstairs. A low murmur broke out across the crowd. The video feed cut to a different clip. A new timestamp read November 10th, 2018, at 1:42 a.m. The angle was different, the frame slightly grainier. It was the backup security footage from my neighbor's yard, the drive I had retrieved a few days prior. A man was standing right at my side entrance, his face fully illuminated by the motion sensor floodlight. He was wearing a dark blue overcoat, his hair graying at the temples, holding a professional lock-picking kit. Marcus Thorne. And that is my back door, I said, 4 nights ago at 1:42 a.m. All the remaining color instantly drained from Marcus Thorne's face. He half stood from his seat in the 3rd row, his eyes rapidly measuring the distance to the nearest exit door. Suddenly, an audio recording began playing across the ballroom's massive sound system. Marcus's voice filled the space, sharp and entirely clear. We need a formal medical assessment to document a progressive cognitive decline over the past 18 months. Make sure the dates align perfectly with the asset transfer agreement. How much proof does it really take to dismantle a beautifully constructed lie? Significantly less than you think, but far more than you'd ever want to face. A second voice cut into the recording. Dr. Aris. I can backdate the evaluation logs easily. As long as we align the overall timeline, it's a simple paperwork adjustment. Marcus's voice replied, Perfect. The second the conservatorship petition is filed, we move everything out within a 48-hour window. Richard won't have any legal standing left to contest it. The audio cut out. Dr. Aris stared down at his hands in absolute despair. Robert's face was completely ash-white. Over by the aisle, Elena's attorney was furiously muttering into his phone, desperately calculating his own exposure. The slide changed one final time, pulling up a legal document carrying an official state header, United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois. Date, March 15th, 2005. Declaration of legal name change. Original name, Elena Hayes. Change to Carmen Lopez. Below the declaration was a list of Social Security records mapping out her shifting identities over the years. Her real name is Elena Hayes, I said, my voice dropping into a steady, quiet calm. But for the last 15 years, she has spent her life shedding skins, faking deaths, disappearing from records, and creating new lives. For over a decade before she ever crossed my path, she was running this exact same operation. I looked straight down at her. The entire marriage was a performance. The names, the backstory, the love. It was all a calculated strategy designed to liquidate my life and leave me with absolutely nothing. Elena's fingers dug deeper into the fabric of her chair's armrests. The sharp, calculating expression was entirely gone from her face, replaced by the dead, hollow rigidity of a person who has been completely exposed. The projection screens went black for 3 full seconds. Then a final audio track began to play. There was no accompanying video, just her voice, sounding entirely relaxed and unguarded, as if she were making a casual call from the front seat of her car. Those older men always think they're genuinely loved. Her voice echoed through the speakers. It's honestly the easiest part of the whole play. You make them feel seen, understood, and protected. They are so incredibly grateful that a younger woman still desires them that they will sign absolutely anything you put in front of them. The cognitive decline script is just a mechanism to accelerate the liquidation timeline. Marcus Thorne's voice answered her. How long before you can initiate the final transfers? 3 weeks. 4 at the most, Elena replied smoothly. The medical documentation is completely set, and the legal filings are drawn up. He trusts me implicitly. By the time we file the involuntary conservatorship petition, he won't even understand what's happening around him. What about the son? Marcus asked. David? Elena let out a soft chuckle. He'll cause a scene in a courtroom, sure, but by then it will be far too late. The assets will be moved offshore and our identities will already be changed. He can spend years fighting a ghost in probate court while we're already living in Europe. The audio clicked off. A heavy, terrifying silence fell over the entire grand ballroom. There was no rustling of suits, no sound of breathing. 400 prominent figures sat completely petrified in their seats. Elena didn't look at the screens behind me. She kept her eyes locked on my face. And for the very first time in the 4 years I had known her, I saw an expression in her eyes that wasn't part of a performance. When the calculations fail, when the backup plans disintegrate, and when the only thing left in the room is the cold reality staring back at you, that is when the floor finally drops. She stood up from her seat in the front row. She didn't try to run. She simply turned to face the entire room, with 400 pairs of eyes locked onto a woman who had just admitted to 15 years of fraud, manipulation, and systematic destruction. Over in the third row, Marcus Thorne had already slipped out of his aisle and was moving toward the side exit, his hand reaching out to push the door open. The door swung inward from the outside. Two federal agents wearing tactical vests stepped squarely into the doorway, their gold badges gleaming under the hallway lights, completely blocking the path. Marcus froze in his tracks, turning slowly around to look back at the stage where I stood, back at the mountain of evidence displayed on the giant screens, and back at the tiny black drive plugged into the system. Thomas stepped out from the shadows of the side stage with David walking right beside him. David was carrying a heavy leather briefcase packed tight with financial forensic audits, sworn affidavits, and property declarations. Elena stood perfectly still by her seat. She didn't run, and she didn't speak. She just watched the walls of her empire close in on her. The arrival of the federal agents didn't shock me. Thomas had coordinated the details 48 hours ago. The only thing that truly caught me off guard was Elena. Instead of turning away, she walked directly toward the stage, climbed the steps, and stood right beside me at the podium. Her first words weren't a defense, and they weren't an argument. She spoke in a quiet, almost curious whisper. "When exactly did you find out?" I looked at her. 4 years of marriage, 4 years of an absolute illusion, and now we were standing shoulder to shoulder on a public stage in front of 400 witnesses, backed by undeniable proof. "Last Tuesday morning," I said, "the exact moment I moved Clara's grandfather clock." She closed her eyes slowly. "I assumed you would never touch that clock." "I wasn't going to. I just wanted to repaint the office wall." A short, bitter laugh escaped her lips. 15 years of running this play, calculating every single angle, and the whole thing falls apart over an old clock and a bucket of paint. I genuinely believed you loved your late wife too much to ever disturb anything connected to her memory. Elena's ultimate mistake wasn't the hidden compartment, the flash drive, or the surveillance lens. Her fatal miscalculation was assuming that my grief would serve as her permanent shield. She believed my love for Clara would completely blind my judgment. She built her entire strategy on the assumption that I would leave my late wife's belongings completely untouched forever. She had mapped out my grief perfectly, but she completely misunderstood what that grief was actually protecting. "Did you ever—" She trailed off, pausing before trying again. "Was any piece of what you felt for me actually real, Richard?" "Every single bit of it was real," I replied, "and that is the only actual difference between us." David walked out from the wings of the stage. He didn't give Elena a single glance, walking straight over to stand right by my side. For the first time in 4 years, father and son were standing together in a public space. We didn't need to speak a single word. His presence next to me was the loudest declaration in the room. Elena took a slow step backward, fully understanding the weight of the dynamic on that stage. She walked down the steps, returned to her seat in the front row, and sat down under the collective gaze of the ballroom, as still as a stone statue. Thomas stepped up to the center aisle, raising his voice to speak into a mobile microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. Law enforcement will need to take formal statements from everyone who witnessed the evidence presented this morning. The charity auction gala is officially canceled." The systematic collapse of the ring began instantly. Elena's attorney, Desmond, stood up and reached into his jacket for his phone, but Thomas blocked his path right in the middle of the aisle. "Mr. Desmond, your firm's trust accounts were completely frozen by a federal court order at 8:47 this morning," Thomas said levelly. $12.6 million in transit funds have been fully intercepted. Desmond's face went entirely dead. "On what legal grounds?" "Conspiracy to commit elder wire fraud and grand larceny. The forensic accounting team has tracked every single transaction your firm logged over the last 7 years. Every single dollar you laundered for Marcus Thorne is officially on paper. Empires are never brought down by a massive army. They crumble from a single loose thread, an antique grandfather clock moved out of a corner, and the enduring love of someone who hid a warning exactly where they knew you'd eventually find it. Robert tried to slip out through the side door, but David stepped squarely in his way, cutting him off completely. "Uncle Robert, take a seat. You aren't going anywhere." Robert stared at him, his chest heaving. "David, I was just 20 years of transactional history," David said, his voice dropping into the flat, mechanical tone of an auditor. "We have every single wire transfer showing Marcus Thorne clearing your $5.5 million gambling debt. We have every single evaluation report you submitted, detailing my father's mental status. We have all the intelligence you sold them regarding his medical appointments, his asset valuations, and his personal vulnerabilities. Thomas has everything." Robert's shoulders completely caved. He sank back into his chair, utterly defeated. Over in the back row, Dr. Eris remained frozen in his seat, staring blankly down at his hands, when a woman marched directly toward him. Anna Lee. She took a thick folder and threw it right onto his lap. "Dr. Aris, these are the records for the $25,000 sponsorship payments wired into your so-called Alzheimer's Research Foundation between 2016 and 2018, straight from Olympus Art Valuation Trust. Do you want to explain to the federal agents why an art fraud operation was personally funding your medical research?" He didn't say a single word. Suddenly, the projection screens lit up once more as a remote video call connected to the ballroom. A weathered, exhausted face filled the massive displays, the exact man from the photograph Anna had shown David. James Howard was patch connecting live from Wisconsin. "My name is James Howard." His voice boomed across the ballroom speakers, filling the space. "I faked my own suicide back in 2015 because I threatened to expose this fraud network, and Marcus Thorne tried to have me murdered." A dead witness had just returned from the grave. James held a heavy stack of documents up directly to his camera lens. "These are the original wire transfer receipts from the Richard Lee case back in 2004. $1.2 million. I kept copies of absolutely everything. Every single victim, every transaction, and every fake identity she ever used. I am fully prepared to take the stand." The screens cut to absolute black. The collapse of a fraud ring always moves from the edges straight toward the center. First go the informants, then the lieutenants, and finally the architect is left standing entirely alone in the ruins, completely powerless to stop the bleed. Marcus Thorne had remained completely motionless in the third row ever since the video evidence started playing. Now he slowly stood up, adjusted the lapels of his suit jacket, and walked toward the exit with a fragile, manufactured calm, the final desperate performance of a con artist who still believed he could control the room. Thomas stepped directly into his path. "Marcus, we need to have a conversation." "I want my attorney present," Marcus replied. "You'll get one," Thomas said, giving a brief hand signal. Two federal agents stepped up on either side of Marcus, gripping his arms. "But right now, we have a federal warrant for your arrest. You're facing 17 counts across 4 separate states for conspiracy to commit grand larceny, elder abuse, identity theft, and wire fraud." The manufactured calm completely dissolved from Marcus's face. For a fraction of a second, I saw exactly what was hiding beneath his mask. It wasn't anger, and it wasn't fear. It was the cold, sudden realization that a system he had meticulously built over 20 years had been entirely dismantled in less than 2 hours. The agents began leading him toward the massive double doors. He took one final look back over his shoulder, not at me, but out the towering floor-to-ceiling windows. Outside, the Chicago snow was still falling, making the gray November sky look incredibly bleak. It looked exactly like the day this whole thing started. And then he was gone. The entire ballroom cleared out within 20 minutes. The prominent attendees filed out in a steady line, stopping to give their statements to federal agents. They walked past Elena, who still sat entirely motionless in the front row. They walked past the podium where the black hard drive remained plugged into the system. David walked up the stage steps toward me and handed me an envelope. It was a cream-colored piece of paper, with the front displaying a handwriting I would recognize anywhere. "The estate lawyer gave this to me," he said softly. "Mom left it for you. Her will had a specific codicil stating it could only be handed to you after the truth came into the light. I stared blankly at my late wife's handwriting. She knew the whole time, I whispered. She knew. David nodded gently. Open it whenever you're ready. The grand hall was almost completely empty now. There was only Thomas wrapping up details with the federal agents, David packing away our legal pads, and Elena sitting completely still. And there I was, holding a letter from a dead woman who had seen the truth long before anyone else. That cream-colored envelope stayed tucked away inside the inner pocket of my suit jacket for 2 full weeks. I couldn't bring myself to open it. It stayed with me through endless hours of depositions at the police station, through long, grueling consultations with attorneys, and through the painful process of figuring out exactly what justice looks like when the illusion finally dies. 2 weeks after the auction gala, I was sitting in a conference room at a high-end law firm downtown. I listened to Thomas count down the legal casualties like a supply officer listing the dead after a battle. Outside, the rain was beating against the glass. A freezing late November Chicago rain, cold, steady, and feeling like it would never stop. Thomas had his folders laid out in a neat line across the table. David sat right next to me, taking continuous notes. The team that had successfully flipped the trap was settling the score. Marcus Thorne, Thomas said, opening the first folder. He's being held without bail on federal charges. 9 counts of conspiracy, elder abuse, wire fraud, and grand larceny. A federal grand jury convenes in January. The prosecutors estimate that if he's convicted on all counts, he's looking at 15 to 25 years. I nodded slowly. The numbers felt incredibly abstract, completely disconnected from the reality of the 4 years I had spent living in a manufactured dream of being loved. Attorney Desmond. His license has been officially suspended by the state bar pending a full investigation. The asset freeze remains fully in place. 3 other victims whose assets he helped transfer have already filed major civil lawsuits against him. He's currently cooperating with prosecutors to reduce his own criminal charges. Dr. Aris, the state medical board is actively investigating his falsified diagnostic records. His research funds have been frozen, and he's facing massive civil liability for the fraudulent evaluations. Thomas paused for a moment, looking across the table at me. Robert is cooperating fully. He signed an agreement to serve as a material witness against Marcus, and he has provided written documentation detailing the entire surveillance network. In exchange, the state is recommending a reduced sentence, most likely probation, full financial restitution, and community service. No jail time. 20 years of friendship, I said softly, my voice barely carrying across the room, and it turns out it's worth exactly a probation agreement. The prosecution needed his testimony to lock down the early timeline, Thomas said plainly. That's just how the system works. The reality of justice is mechanical and entirely unsatisfying. It's a system built on negotiations, plea deals, and sentencing guidelines. There is absolutely nothing in it that can take what was stolen from you and hand it back unchanged. Thomas flipped open the next folder. Elna Hayes. She is also cooperating fully with the federal investigation. She signed a plea deal to reduce her sentencing guidelines in exchange for mapping out the entire corporate framework of the operation. She documented a 14-year history, including 23 separate fraud schemes using different identities. 23. I'd only known about 10 names on that list. Before she ever targeted me, 23 innocent lives had been systematically liquidated. Every single one was on paper now, part of a sinister pattern I had failed to see. The prosecutors are building a full RICO case against Marcus's entire network, Thomas continued. Elena's testimony is the anchor for the prosecution. She will serve time. With her cooperation credits, it will likely land between 8 and 12 years, significantly lighter than what she actually deserves. What about the money? David asked. Asset recovery is going to be an incredibly messy process, Thomas replied. We're dealing with multiple offshore accounts, separate jurisdictions, and a significant portion of the funds has already been completely laundered. The Victim Restitution Fund might recover 40%. The rest is permanently gone. You can never truly measure justice by the number of years someone spends in a cell or the licenses that get revoked. You measure it by the immense weight of the things that were taken from you that can never be returned. There's one more thing, Thomas said, turning his attention to David. Your trust restructuring paperwork has been fully validated by the courts. The asset transfers you executed 14 months ago are legally bulletproof. I turned my head to look at my son. What asset transfers? David met my gaze squarely. Last year, when you were hospitalized for 3 days after that minor heart incident, you spent 2 weeks recovering at home. I brought some paperwork to your bedside for you to sign. I told you they were updated medical insurance forms and an emergency healthcare proxy. I remember signing them, I said slowly, digging into my memory. They weren't insurance forms, Dad, David said softly. It was an irrevocable trust transfer. It moved the operational control of Vance Preservation into a blind trust and listed me as the sole trustee. You kept your full ownership, but I took control of every major financial decision, asset flow, and transaction. You signed the papers when you were completely exhausted in that hospital room, without looking closely at the text. I told myself at the time that I was doing it to protect you from an emergency, to keep the firm from being liquidated if you ever lost capacity. The conference room went dead silent, save for the freezing rain beating against the windows. When exactly did you do this? I asked. The second you got out of the clinic, David whispered. September 2017. A full 14 months before Elena even began faking your cognitive decline records. She spent years trying to seize control of a company that actually hasn't been under your legal authority for over a year. Thomas slid another document across the polished table. The conservatorship petition Elena was preparing to file would have given her control over your personal decisions and your residential property. But the core assets of Vance Preservation were completely locked down by David. All she was about to inherit was an empty shell. The real fortune was already protected. I stared at my son. You didn't trust that I could protect myself. I didn't trust anyone who was trying to circle you when you were down, David said. You had just suffered a heart incident. You were incredibly vulnerable, and Elena was being far too attentive in a way that didn't track. I didn't have the proof, and I couldn't explain what was wrong, so I just used the tools I had to secure what I could protect. When your own child uses the exact same protective instincts on you that you once used on him, the ground shifts permanently. It isn't a reversal of roles. It's a complete circle of love. Thank you, I said. His hand reached across the table, gripping mine tightly. Thomas cleared his throat, closing his notepad. The final item. James Howard's situation is complicated. His evidence regarding the 2004 case was the anchor we needed, but there's no avoiding the fact that he actively participated in the 2009 fraud scheme in Seattle. When a material witness is also a documented co-conspirator, the sentencing guidelines become incredibly dense. What's going to happen to him? I asked. Because of his federal cooperation, they're recommending leniency. He's likely looking at 3 to 5 years. He knew the risk the second he agreed to show his face. Did he leave any message? Thomas pulled a handwritten note out of his pocket. He passed this along through his defense attorney. It's just 3 sentences. I know. I accept it. I'm trading a temporary prison sentence for permanent peace of mind. James Howard, the man who helped scam a Seattle widower out of $400,000, the man who lost everything when the system turned on him, and the man who spent 3 years living as a ghost, had finally accepted the cost of admission for his own redemption. The conference room suddenly felt incredibly tight. The rain outside grew noticeably louder against the glass. David reached into his briefcase one final time and pulled out that cream-colored envelope with Clara's neat, meticulous handwriting displaying my name across the front. You still haven't opened this, he said softly. Maybe it's finally time. I took the envelope from him. The postmark across the seal read, March 14th, 2013, exactly 6 weeks before she passed away. Back then, her mind was still perfectly sharp, and she could still write her characters flat and neat. She knew, I said. She knew. David confirmed gently. Read it whenever you're ready. I'm right here with you. I ended up leaving Clara's letter untouched for another full week. It wasn't out of fear, but because I knew that once I broke that seal and read her words, it would be the absolute last time she would ever speak to me. I simply wasn't ready to face that final goodbye. 3 weeks after the auction gala, Robert's name flashed across my phone screen. I was sitting inside my F-150 in a crowded supermarket parking lot, watching the screen light up and letting it ring 2 full times before I finally picked up. Richard, his voice sounded incredibly old, hollowed out. I'm heading in to meet with the federal prosecutors tomorrow morning to sign the plea agreement, so I wanted to call you directly. I know you don't owe me a damn thing, and I'm not calling to beg for your forgiveness. I watched the freezing rain slice down the windshield, gathering into heavy streams. Then what exactly are you asking for, Robert? Nothing. I just... He trailed off, pausing before trying again. I know absolutely nothing I say now can alter what happened. But I need you to know that for 20 years, our friendship was entirely real. It was just that final choice where I lost my way. The parking lot was mostly empty. A woman pushed her grocery cart through the downpour, keeping her head low against the wind. Ordinary people doing entirely ordinary things. And there I was, sitting in my truck, forced to accept an absurd reality. That absolute systematic betrayal and genuine deep-seated friendship could actively exist within the exact same relationship. So you're telling me that 20 years of friendship was entirely real, and the 4 years you spent selling me out to Marcus Thorne for $5.5 million was also real? I asked. Yes. Both are true? Yes. Robert's heavy breathing rattled through the receiver. I was your friend, Richard, and I was also the man who sold you out. I have absolutely no idea how to reconcile those two things. I just know they are both undeniably true. I closed my eyes tightly against the steering wheel. I know, Robert, and that is exactly why it hurts so much. There was a long, heavy silence on the line. I'm sorry, he whispered, if that means anything at all anymore. It means something, I said. It isn't nearly enough, but it means something. The line clicked dead. I sat there in the silence of my pickup, listening to the rain beat relentlessly against the aluminum roof, watching the heat rise off the hood. The heater was running, and a thick layer of fog was starting to cloud the windows. Outside, the world kept moving forward with an unfeeling normalcy. People bought groceries, parked their cars, and lived their lives. 20 years of weekend golf, late-night phone calls, and holding each other up through weddings and funerals. 20 years of a genuine bond, and 4 years of a systematic con. Both were entirely real. Robert was right. I had absolutely no idea how to reconcile them either. Where exactly does the friendship end, and where does the betrayal begin? There wasn't a sharp, clean line dividing them. It was just a long, fading stretch of gray until a final choice stained everything absolute black. The downpour grew heavier. I started the engine and drove back home, cutting through streets that looked completely identical to how they had before the illusion shattered. Chicago in December, wet, freezing, and entirely familiar. A week later, I met up with David and Anna at the exact same cafe in Oak Park where they had initially connected. Anna looked completely different now, her posture noticeably lighter. It was the distinct look of someone who had finally dropped a heavy burden they'd been forced to carry for years. Her brother had been officially released, and as a condition for her full cooperation against Marcus Thorne, the old state charges against him were entirely dismissed. She was already packing up to leave Chicago, moving somewhere far away from Marcus's shadow to start over. I want to thank you both, Anna said, looking across the table. Thank you for believing me, and thank you for actually using the information I provided. David reached into his briefcase and pulled out a faded, heavily creased envelope, the exact piece of paper carrying Anna's handwriting from 2008 that he had kept for 10 full years. This is the letter you mailed, right? David asked, sliding it across the middle of the table. Anna stared down at the handwriting, tracing her finger gently along the edge of the paper. I was only 23 back then, absolutely terrified. I had just watched my father die in complete disgrace, and I knew Elena was preparing to run the exact same play on her next target. I had no idea what else to do. You tried to warn him, David said. That is already far more than most people would have done. I mailed it anonymously straight to his firm. Anna said, looking over at me. I was too afraid to put my real name on the return address. Did you ever actually see it, Richard? No, I said softly. David intercepted it. Anna's eyes shifted back to David, carrying a silent question. David picked up the envelope, held it in his palm for a brief moment, and then placed it firmly back into Anna's hands. I was 18 years old at the time, David explained, his voice thick with emotion. I was incredibly angry that my father was trying to move on so quickly after my mother's death, angry at the entire world. I opened the mail assuming it was just some bitter ex-girlfriend trying to sabotage his happiness. When I finished reading it, I forced myself to believe it was all a lie. He paused, staring down at the faded paper. But I kept it for 10 years. It stayed with me through college, through the years when my father and I didn't speak, through everything. I told myself I kept it because I might need the evidence one day. But in reality, his voice cracked slightly, it gave me a lifeline. It gave me something to hold on to when I believed my father didn't need me anymore. Your letter kept us connected, even when we weren't speaking. Anna rubbed her thumb against the worn edge of the envelope. Thank you for keeping it, and thank you for using it when it mattered most. Thank you for writing it, David replied. The three of us sat together for another hour. 3 ordinary people bound together by a strange math of deception, loss, guilt, and redemption. Then Anna tucked the letter safely into her coat pocket, stood up, and walked out into her next life. David walked me out to my truck. The December twilight came incredibly early, and the streetlights were already casting long, bright reflections across the wet asphalt. I'm heading back to New York next week, Dad, he said. I nodded slowly. I figured you'd have to. But this time around, you actually have my direct number. You better use it often. It wasn't a question, it was a firm command. I will, I promised, even if it's just to complain about the Chicago blizzards or to tell you what I had for dinner. We'll stay in touch. Some goodbyes aren't a final ending. They're just a necessary recalibration, finding the exact right distance where love can actively survive without suffocating. Every single week, I added. He stepped forward on the sidewalk and wrapped his arms around me, holding on to the embrace significantly longer than usual. When he finally let go, his eyes were wet. You're going to be completely fine, Dad, he said. You too, kid. He smiled. Yeah, I think I will be. I drove home through the familiar streets, pulling into the driveway and stepping inside a house that felt entirely different now. Some corners felt completely empty, while others felt incredibly full. David's blind trust paperwork sat flat on my desk. Thomas's legal summaries and the evidence inventories from the auction gala were spread out beside it, the concrete proof of a life that had been systematically dismantled and carefully pieced back together. And right on the side table next to the armchair where Clara used to sit for 20 years, rested that cream-colored envelope. The house was perfectly quiet. There was no performance, no surveillance lenses, and no carefully calculated lies. There was only me, the silence, and the final words of my late wife. I picked up the envelope, feeling the physical weight of the paper, the ink, and the love trapped inside. That night, sitting completely alone in that house for the very first time since the gala, I finally broke the seal on Clara's letter. The date was written clearly across the top, March 14th, 2013. 6 weeks before she passed away, back when her mind was still entirely clear and she knew exactly what she was committing to paper. I sat down in her chair, unfolded the page, and began to read. Clara's letter contained the exact words I needed to hear most. She wrote that she had already noticed the fractures in our perimeter. She wrote that she was leaving a trail behind, praying that I would find it whenever I was finally ready to look. And she wrote that she trusted me entirely to save myself in the end. 5.5 years later, I finally understood exactly what she meant. On Sunday morning, I brewed a fresh pot of coffee. No sedatives, no spiked bourbon cocktails. It was the very first choice I had made entirely for myself in over 6 months. The house stayed completely still. The pale, crisp December sunlight drifted through the kitchen windows, clean and clear. Outside, Hector was managing the final lawn maintenance before the deep winter freeze, pushing his old mower across the yard, leaving perfectly straight lines in the faded grass. That lawn wouldn't grow again until next spring. Hector had been caring for my yard for 10 years. I didn't even know his last name. Even though I had scanned the security logs, I never bothered to ask him directly. He likely didn't care about my corporate family history either. We had never shared a conversation that went deeper than a quick remark about the blizzard or a confirmation of his paycheck. But every other Sunday, right on cue, he would show up at the gate, finish his work, and leave the property in significantly better shape than he found it. I tapped lightly against the kitchen window pane. He looked up, his weathered face mapping out a lifetime of hard work, his eyes squinting against the winter sun. I raised my hand in a simple salute. He gave me a firm nod in return and went right back to pushing his mower. It was that simple. Two men who understood the work, the silent movement of the seasons and ending in a quiet place to start over. I carried my mug up to the office. Clara's antique grandfather clock had been permanently moved out, sent away for complete restoration. I planned to hang a painting across the empty stretch of wall. I hauled an old landscape piece Clara had painted years ago out of the storage locker. The frame felt significantly heavier than I remembered. Or maybe I was just getting older, finally feeling the weight of things I used to lift without a second thought. I carefully mounted the frame onto the wall where the clock used to sit, aligning the edges perfectly. The painting fit the space flawlessly. I took a step back to study her work. The gray, choppy waters of Lake Michigan, with a massive storm brewing in the distance. Clara painted it because it reminded her of our younger days together by the lake. I had never particularly liked the piece in the past. It always felt too dark, too brooding. Gin, but it belonged to her, and that was more than enough. I turned around to slide the wooden panel back over the hidden compartment behind the frame. The space was completely empty now. The black hard drive had been cataloged as federal evidence weeks ago, its contents duplicated and filed away in a government archive. But as my hand brushed against the edge of the wood, I spotted something else. A tiny scrap of paper was wedged deep into the seam of the frame. It was a single sheet of thin diary paper, the exact kind Clara used to use for her personal journals. It had been trapped in that seam significantly longer than the hard drive. You could tell just by looking at the yellowed edges and the thick layer of dust gathered in the fold. I carefully slipped it out of the seam. It was Clara's handwriting. The date read October 2011, 4 full years before she passed away, long before Elena ever entered the picture, long before the fraud network targeted me, and long before this entire nightmare even began. I sank down onto the floor, leaning my back against the wall directly beneath her painting, and began to read. Richard, if you are discovering this note, it means you likely moved that grandfather clock out of the corner because you wanted to repaint the office wall. You always did have a habit of doing exactly what people asked of you when you wanted to be helpful. I carved out this hidden space to store a few personal journals that I wrote during those long midnights when my mind was racing with worry, because I never wanted to burden you with my fears. If a day comes where you are reading these words and I am already gone, please promise me you will never blame yourself for loving the wrong person. You didn't do anything wrong, Richard. You simply poured everything you had into loving someone, and pouring out your entire heart can never be a mistake. I love you, Clara. Protection doesn't always show up as a loud, dramatic warning to run away from danger. Sometimes it's just a quiet note left behind in a wall, telling you, whatever choices you made them out of love, and that is entirely enough. I folded the small sheet of paper carefully and slid it into the front pocket of my shirt, resting right against my heart. Clara knew me far too well. She knew I would spend my days blaming myself for the vulnerability. She knew I would dissect every single moment, every single transaction, looking for the exact milestone where I should have noticed the pattern. She had left this absolution behind years before any danger ever existed, a permanent pardon for a mistake I hadn't even made yet. I slowly stood up, looking up at her painting of Lake Michigan. I stared at the dark waters, the rolling storm clouds, and the vast open horizon stretching far beyond the edges of the frame. For the first time in a very long time, I let out a genuine, peaceful laugh. Throughout this entire ordeal, I've learned a few incredibly practical lessons. If you're listening out there, these are pieces of advice worth sharing. Always check the public land registry at the county clerk's office to verify property titles before entering a marriage. Freezing your credit reports across the three major bureaus, Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion, costs absolutely nothing. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau carries massive resources dedicated to preventing elder financial exploitation. And if your spouse is aggressively recommending a specific family physician, always seek an independent, third-party second opinion. Those steps are incredibly important, but the real lesson doesn't live inside a checklist or a legal procedure. It's simply this: stay alert. Keep asking questions. When someone genuinely loves you, they won't demand your silence whenever you point out an inconsistency in your life. They won't fly into a defensive rage the second you notice a pattern. They won't systematically isolate you from the people who actually care about your safety. And they will never try to convince you that your own intuition is just you losing your mind. Real love never requires you to be blind. It requires you to be whole. It took me a full 6 weeks after everything went down to finally throw away that bottle of spiked bourbon Elena had bought for the pantry. For months, every single night when she poured that glass, I drank it. I did it because I mistook being taken care of for actually being loved. I mistook the performance of love for love itself. Clara never poured me those strange, customized cocktails. She poured me pure black coffee because she knew that was exactly how I liked it. She would pick massive arguments with me over politics, over finances, or over whether a room actually needed a fresh coat of paint. She questioned my decisions, and she fully expected me to question hers in return. And she left a note behind in a wall panel, pardoning me for a mistake I hadn't even committed yet. That was real love. Messy, argumentative, and constantly challenging. The other version was just a cheap, heavily rehearsed production in a theater. Sometimes the truth doesn't hit your life like a forcefully kicked-in door. Sometimes it just slips out from behind a grandfather clock you've looked at every single day for 20 years without ever moving. I stand in the office now with my mug in my hand, Clara's landscape painting hanging right where it belongs, and her scrap of paper tucked safely inside my pocket. Outside, Hector finishes up the lawn, hooks the mower onto his truck bed, and drives away without bothering to knock. Next Sunday, or the Sunday after that, he'll show up right at the gate again. The seasons will change, the grass will wither and grow back, and life will keep moving forward with its cold, unfeeling, yet incredibly resilient daily beauty, and I will remain alert. If you think I handled this situation the right way, drop a 1 in the comments section below. If you have a relative or a friend who genuinely needs to hear this warning, drop a 2. And if you've ever discovered a tiny, insignificant detail in your own life that completely altered how you looked at someone you loved, drop a 3. Stay alert. Keep asking questions. Protect the people you care about by teaching them exactly how to protect themselves. And please remember, real love will never ask you to stop asking questions. That was the ultimate lesson Clara left behind for me. That was the truth that slipped out from behind a clock I had stared at for 2 decades. Sometimes all the answers we are looking for have been sitting there the entire time. We just have to be completely ready to see them. I've been telling this story for a while now, but every single time I get to this specific part, I still have to pause and just sit quietly for a moment. Because after living through all of it, after the encrypted hard drive, the fake passports, and watching Elena's real name display in front of 400 people, I realized something incredibly important. Trusting someone isn't a sign of weakness, and loving someone without holding anything back isn't foolish. I did both of those things, and I don't regret either of them for a second. The only thing I truly regret are the years I spent completely silent, the years I stopped asking questions, the mornings where I looked at financial discrepancies that didn't track and just shrugged them off, the moments where I let my own son's phone calls roll straight into voicemail. Don't become the man I was. Look over your documents. Read through every single line item. If something feels off at the dinner table, ask the question. You have every legal and moral right to know the truth. After everything that happened, I find myself constantly thinking about that verse from Proverbs. Keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flow the springs of life. I didn't guard my heart the way I should have, but I was fortunate enough to get a second chance. Not everyone gets that kind of luck. In my personal opinion, experiencing financial betrayal inside a marriage is one of the absolute loneliest disasters a person can face. It isn't because of the missing cash. It's because of the deafening, heavy silence left behind inside a house you genuinely believed you knew inside and out. There are plenty of stories out there regarding family dynamics and revenge, but standard revenge never teaches you how to navigate a completely silent retaliation, one where nobody ever raises their voice, yet an entire empire dissolves into absolute dust on a Wednesday morning inside a hotel ballroom. These stories of family betrayal teach us that the most lethal threats always wear the most familiar faces. But in the end, they also remind us that the truth will always find a way to bleed through, even if it has to hide inside a wall, behind a grandfather clock, or beneath a painting. If this story of a father's quiet retaliation touched you today, please share it with someone who might need to hear its message tonight. If you suspect someone in your own circle is dealing with a similar situation, find a way to gently step in. And if you want to see more of these deep, slow-burning stories of calculated exposure and quiet justice, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Every week, I'll bring you true accounts detailing trust, family, and the heavy cost of staying silent. Leave a comment down below. Tell me if your number is 1, 2, or 3, and let me know where you're watching from. I genuinely read every single response. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this story. It truly means the world to me. And just as a final reminder before you go, the accounts shared on this channel contain dramatized elements meant for reflection and warning. If this isn't the kind of content you were looking for, that's completely fine. Feel free to turn off the video and find something you enjoy. But if you're still here, I'll see you right in the next story.